Lord Voldemort is a half-blood wizard? Medea's revelations in the paper set off a storm in the Great Hall. The strongest reaction came from the Slytherins. The leader of pure-blood ideology himself a half-blood? For many young wizards raised on pure-blood rhetoric, that was intolerable. If anyone else had said it, they might have scoffed, but the claim came from Medea Slytherin, the founder's daughter. Her words carried weight, and many Slytherin students, especially the descendants of the Death Eaters, were visibly unsettled. "No, that can't be true," Draco shrieked, high and incredulous. Pansy Parkinson was quick to back him up. "Draco, this is fake. Miss Slytherin wouldn't give an interview to that rag." Goyle and Crabbe nodded dumbly, mouths full. Marcus Flint, the notorious roughneck of the house, slammed the paper down so hard he knocked over his milk. Millicent Bulstrode, recently raised in status by her ties to the Traverses, lifted her chin and pretended to look offended. "This is sensationalism," she declared, a ploy to lead people astray. Across the hall, reactions were different. Most Gryffindors and Hufflepuffs seemed to accept Medea's claims. Gryffindors in particular were loud with agreement, perhaps enjoying the ruffle it caused in Slytherin. Ravenclaws were more analytical, neither convinced nor dismissive, but debating why Medea would go public in this way. "What do you think, Scott?" Eddie asked, having been talking with Roger and Milton. Scott shook his head. "Medea is stating facts. She's not trying to disrespect you-know-who," Roger pressed. Scott shook his head again. "Being a half-blood isn't an insult to her. I heard her speak with Dumbledore once. She isn't a pure-blood supremacist. She doesn't even look down on Muggles." "That's surprising," someone murmured. Scott smiled. "Keep reading. This interview is remarkable." He lowered his head and read on. "Unbelievable. But if it's you, I'll believe it. Thank you. When I learned of Lord Voldemort's actions, I decided to correct misunderstandings about him. The next question might be sensitive. You called you-know-whose actions mistakes. Do you mean you think pure-blood supremacy is wrong?" "I don't want to argue about isms, but I do think any ideology taken to an extreme is dangerous. When people point wands at others and bring panic to the wizarding world, that is unquestionably wrong. Reporter, do you believe all wizards are equal, regardless of origin?" "Of course. We are all chosen by magic and share its wonders. It's hard to imagine. The Slytherin name has come to represent pure-blood interests. It's become a banner." "I know, I was surprised when I learned how that happened. Can you explain?" "It concerns my father's reputation. There are many rumors that he opposed Muggle-borns attending Hogwarts, but that's false. The founders created Hogwarts to educate young wizards, even those from non-magical families. That was their purpose. My father was a man of principle. He never abandoned that intent." Reporter, why did later generations misinterpret Slytherin? "Partly because my father left Hogwarts and there were disagreements, chiefly over whether to teach certain dangerous arts. Another factor is the Chamber of Secrets legend, which was fabricated by Lord Voldemort." Reporter, how so? Medea, my father's disagreements with the other founders weren't why he left. He left to better protect Hogwarts. In those early days, many dark wizards could no longer take apprentices because of the school. They even attacked teachers and students to strike back. What my father placed in the chamber was meant as protection. Lord Voldemort, who could speak Parseltongue, discovered it and took control. He spread lies to present himself as the heir of Slytherin. Regardless, I find your explanation believable. I've always held the founders in equal esteem. Thank you. You said you want to improve the future of the wizarding world. How will you do that? Medea, we share this planet with many species. Humans dominate it. But humans are divided into Muggles and wizards are a tiny portion. Muggles aren't our enemies, but they are competitors. Because we are fewer in number, we must ensure we remain more competitive to survive and thrive. Scott put the paper down for a moment, smiling at the clarity and calm of Medea's answers. I knew it. I knew the one in that interview wasn't the real Miss Slytherin. Draco burst out from the Slytherin table, triumphant and loud. If that were really her, why would she speak of Muggles like that? He sneered. When did Muggles and wizards become comparable? This is ridiculous. The pure-blood supremacists and descendants of Death Eaters in Slytherin immediately perked up at what Draco had said. He's absolutely right, Draco. This is a joke. Compete with muggles to survive? How ignorant do you have to be to say that? A rational person wouldn't say something like this. That so-called exclusive interview is just that hateful Skeeter staging and directing it herself. No, that slippery woman wouldn't do this for nothing. Someone's pulling her strings. They began to argue over who might have instigated the Daily Prophet and Rita Skeeter and what their goals were. They weren't the only ones doubting the interview because of the idea that wizards and muggles are competitors. Students across the houses, Slytherin, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, even Gryffindor, were skeptical. Scott noticed that almost all of them who came from long wizarding families misunderstood muggles entirely. In the wizarding world, families with no muggle background rarely bothered to understand muggles. They could walk through the muggle world 1,000 times and still cling to ancient stereotypes, images and judgments passed down for centuries. Even well-meaning people like Arthur Weasley or Professor Burbage of Muggle Studies had a limited, romanticized view of the Muggle world. From that perspective, Medea, who had been asleep for 1,000 years, then awakened and looked clearly at the Muggle world, was extraordinarily unusual in her awareness. Scott kept out of the arguing and read the rest of the interview in the paper. The exchange ran like this. Reporter, if I heard correctly, you mean that in terms of survival, muggles have the power to compete with wizards? You could say that. That's a hard thing to accept. Yes, if I hadn't seen the numbers of people and the speed of their technological development myself, I wouldn't have believed it either. Reporter, do you know making such claims publicly will only invite more questions? That's fine. My words are for truly intelligent wizards. I believe they will understand what I mean. All right, how do you plan to ensure wizards are competitive enough? By accelerating discovery in the magical world from every angle. We don't need to develop technology like muggles do. We have magic. Everything muggles achieve through technology, we can do through magic, and better. You already have a concrete plan? Yes. I've gathered a group of like-minded wizards. Their backgrounds vary, but they're talented, and we share the same goal. Reporter, can you tell us your next step? I'll deal with the last Horcrux of Lord Voldemort next Sunday at the old Gaunt family mansion. Reporter, what are you trying to convey with that action? Lord Voldemort's crimes will be ended by me, by the daughter of Salazar, the mistress of the Gaunt line from 1,000 years ago. I don't know what to say. It's all right. Our focus should be on the future. Scott skimmed the rest and, finding no more substance, folded the paper. Around him, most students had finished reading. Many wore bewildered expressions. Medea's purpose wasn't immediately clear to them. This is strange. No, very strange, Eddie muttered beside him. What's strange? Roger asked. Everything, Eddie said. This turns my whole idea of Slytherin upside down. We don't know her, Milton whispered. To call muggles competitors shows she doesn't look down on them, Roger said. That's completely different from what you'd expect from Slytherin. And you know who? Eddie lowered his voice. I always thought that if he came back, Headmaster Dumbledore would be the one to lead the fight. You forget, we have our savior, Roger laughed. He glanced toward Gryffindor. But that's impossible. Potter's just a normal young wizard. Only his Quidditch is any good. Milton looked uncertain. Is it true, this Horcrux business? If she's right, you know who will try to stop her from destroying it. Not just him, his followers too. I bet Dumbledore will show up at the Gaunt mansion, Eddie said, sounding half regretful. A pity we can't go. This isn't the Muggle world. We can't even watch it on TV. You want to go? To your death? Roger feigned exasperation. He'd risk his life to watch the show, Scott said with a smile. Luna, suddenly cryptic, leaned in. Scott, I feel like the day the prophecy comes true is drawing closer. Scott looked at her. Eddie interrupted. Oh, Luna, you're only in your 2nd year. Haven't you had divination yet? Luna didn't seem to understand the point. She went on to Scott. I have a premonition. So the witch's crisis is near too? Scott smiled and glanced at the newspaper again. The interview had already set the British magical world buzzing. Medea had explained her actions. Would anyone change their minds about her? Everyone knew her acts weren't as simple as draining magic from 2 ancient buildings. Scott had a lingering intuition. Just as Salazar's leaving Hogwarts had not been only to secretly protect the school, Medea's drive to change the magical world might not be purely idealistic. Scott had met Medea face to face only 3 times at Hogwarts. Whether by her deeds, her words, or her magic, Medea had always seemed extremely cold. That first impression had stuck. No matter what she did afterward, Scott remained wary. He had never forgotten Helena's words, that Medea had been obsessed with winning Salazar's approval. Had that obsession really vanished? That afternoon, Scott sought out Helena. "Have you seen today's interview, Helena?" he asked. Helena nodded. "I saw it," she said softly. "Medea wants to completely devour Lord Voldemort's soul." "And the rest, her noble ideals?" Scott asked. Helena floated in the air and looked down at him. "What do you think?" Scott had hoped to hear her opinion, but he answered instead. "Maybe everything she said is true, but I still feel that's not the whole story." "My view is the same," Helena smiled. "But I don't know what she ultimately wants either." In the evening, Scott went to the room of requirement and showed the paper to the Ravenclaw portrait. "I've already seen it," the portrait said with a smile. "I'm not confined here. I can move between portraits throughout the castle." Scott folded the paper away. "Don't read too much into it," the portrait advised. "Observe. You don't need to obsess over it." "I think Dumbledore will get involved," Scott said. "Do you think Lord Voldemort will show?" the portrait asked. "Voldemort doesn't know Harry is a Horcrux," Scott replied. "In his mind, that last one is his final Horcrux." "That's only your belief," the portrait said. "True," Scott agreed. Ravenclaw didn't want to discuss it further, so Scott left the room of requirement. On the stairs, a voice stopped him. He hadn't been approached from behind like that in a long time, and spun around so quickly his wand flicked up, only to find no one. "Harry," he whispered. "It's me," came the answer. Harry was under his invisibility cloak. Without concentrating, Scott couldn't sense him. "What are you doing?" Scott asked. "Just wandering," Harry said, pulling down the hood so only his head hung in the air. "Going for a walk." "It's not curfew yet," Scott said, a little puzzled. "I just wanted to walk alone," Harry answered, embarrassed. "Carry on," Scott said, ready to move off. "Wait," Harry called him back. Scott turned. Harry looked left and right, then asked in an even quieter voice, "Last time in the headmaster's office, was everything you and Dumbledore said true?" He reached up and touched the lightning-shaped scar on his forehead. "Is my link to him really just because of the prophecy?" Scott glanced at the scar. "Did you have another dream?" Harry nodded. "But I won't tell you what I dreamed unless you answer my question." Scott smiled. "You should ask Dumbledore. Tell him your dream too." Harry paused, surprised. "You can't tell me?" Scott had been that age once. When something big happened, you wanted to talk to your peers, not the grown-ups. He understood. "What do you think I should know, Harry?" He smiled. "You should go find the person who can truly fix it. This isn't a small matter. It's important." "All right." Harry didn't seem wholly convinced by Scott's response. He pulled up his hood and left after a quick farewell. Scott couldn't learn the dream from the little Harry figure he sometimes used to sense things. Harry hadn't been carrying his trunk. Knowing how real Harry's dreams were, Scott wondered who else the boy might tell besides Ron. Scott returned to Ravenclaw Tower. The common room was still full of people arguing about the interview. He saw Eddie and Milton at a long table, trying to work on essays. "Haven't you heard what everyone's saying?" he asked. Eddie kept writing without stopping. "Some say it's a farce, a stunt to shake off the witch's bad image. They're sure you-know-who won't appear at all." Milton murmured, half-focused on his essay. "Not everyone thinks that," Eddie went on, warming to the subject. "Some suspect the witch and the Dark Lord are working together. After all, the Dark Lord is her descendant. They think it's a trap to lure Dumbledore and the others." "Oh," Milton said. "I think it might be a trap set by the witch and the headmaster together," Eddie added, with mock enthusiasm. Scott sat beside them. "You think the headmaster and the witch would cooperate?" "Oh, Scott," Eddie said, looking up. "That's entirely possible. First, they team up to beat the Dark Lord, then they get rid of the witch. Perfect plan." Scott could tell he was being deliberately absurd. "Why don't you run it by the headmaster, then?" After teasing Eddie, Scott got up and headed for his dormitory. "Scott!" someone called as he pushed open his door. Lambeau was perched on his bedside table. 343. News, violence, business opportunities. Good evening, Lambo. Scott closed the dormitory door. What brings you here? Of course I'm here for something important. Lambo fluttered its wings. Scott went to his bed and sat down. Has the ministry's list of members who sided with Medea been released? He asked. Only a partial list so far, Lambo said. But I've been watching a bit longer, and Fudge's situation is clearly getting worse. He hasn't resisted? Scott asked, surprised. I haven't seen any signs of resistance, Lambo replied. There's more to this than meets the eye. Either Fudge is being threatened and controlled, or he's biding his time and waiting for an opportunity. You might be right, but my powers are limited. I can't investigate further or confirm anything, Lambo added. That's fine. We won't be getting involved anyway. I just wanted the general picture, Scott said, indifferent. By the way, were you at the ministry today? Tell me how this morning's Daily Prophet interview landed. Lambo cocked its head. Ah, that was the other thing I came to tell you. That interview stirred up a huge fuss at the ministry. Scott nodded for it to continue. Most wizards are inclined to wait and see. Some are very pleased. Those are probably Medea's accomplices, Lambo said. There are a few, mostly aurors, who want to get to the gaunt old house ahead of time and try to capture Medea. I see, Scott said. What are you going to do? Me. Scott smiled. Nothing. This isn't my business. I want to watch the show. Lambo agreed. I like to watch the show too. They both laughed. Just then, Scott sensed Roger's magical signature in the corridor. He glanced at Lambo. The bird fell quiet. Roger shoved the dormitory door open a moment later. Scott looked up and froze. You? He stared at the mark on Roger's cheek. Who hit you? Roger came in with a sullen face, set his broom down, stripped off his robes, and sat on the edge of the bed to take off his Quidditch protective gear. He didn't answer at first, and he moved silently as he worked. Scott watched the handprint on Roger's face and then looked at his own hands, and the conclusion formed almost at once. Someone had slapped Roger. Had the playboy finally met his match? When Roger finally spoke, it was in a low voice. Caccini. She's like a different person. Caccini? Scott blinked. Didn't you two break up ages ago? It's been more than half a year. Roger rubbed his face. I haven't paid attention to her in a long time. I was at the Quidditch pitch earlier. Scott remembered something then and felt a pang of guilt. Could it be because he'd taken Roger's appearance with Polyjuice last summer? No, half a year had passed. Still, the memory nagged. So she just came up and slapped you in front of everyone? Scott asked. Roger nodded. Scott's surprise grew. As captain of the Quidditch team, Roger being slapped publicly by an ex would be humiliating. No wonder he was steamed. But Scott didn't think it was like Caccini to resort to violence. She's changed, Roger said again, bewildered. I don't know what got into her. Why did she hit you? Scott pressed. Roger shook his head. Don't know. Forget it. I was the one who ended it, so consider this the end of it. Seeing Roger had reconciled himself, Scott let the matter drop and retrieved his ancient runes notebook from the shelf. After that day, talk of Medea and you-know-who dominated Hogwarts. Everyone was waiting for the next development. Students wanted to travel to the gaunt old house to find out if the newspaper interview was true. Would Medea really go there to destroy the Horcrux? Would Lord Voldemort appear? Those were the questions everyone wanted answers to. One afternoon, the Weasley twins showed up at Scott's dormitory and dragged him down a secret passage to their workshop. Eddie was already there. This is a huge business opportunity, Eddie said. People want answers fast. Are you planning to go and interview? Fred asked, grinning. George gave Eddie an enthusiastic thumbs up. Of course not. I wouldn't go to somewhere so dangerous. Eddie snapped. So how do you plan to make money from this? Scott asked. Eddie shrugged. We can brainstorm. Maybe we'll figure something out. Fred was already daydreaming. The clash between Slytherin's daughter and you-know-who. What a scene that would be. You're crazy, Fred, George barked, slapping his brother on the shoulder. We can't go there. I never said we'd go. Fred rolled his eyes. I was just thinking, maybe we could invent a way to see the gaunt old house from Hogwarts. Sorry, I don't have that sort of ingenuity, George said. The eavesdropping devices we can make only listen to nearby sounds. Is there no way to make money from this? Eddie asked Scott. Any ideas? Scott rubbed his temple. What ideas could I have? It's too far. My listening bats can't connect that distance, and I'm not going to risk sneaking near the gaunt old house. Now, cameras. Fred suddenly brightened, eyes shining. We can make enchanted cameras take pictures automatically and sell live photos. George's eyes lit up too. Brilliant, Fred. Scott shook his head. Cameras have to be set up ahead of time. Who's going to place them there? We can hire owls, Fred said. Let owls fly over the gaunt old house. George nodded, catching on. Then you just need to make the cameras take pictures automatically. Eddie's excitement grew. That could actually work. No, there's something better, Scott interrupted. The three of them turned to him. Panoramic telescopes, he said. The kind used to watch large Quidditch matches that can replay and review in slow motion. Oh, we forgot about that, Fred said, annoyed with himself. We tried to get Mum to buy us one once. She refused flat out. Panoramic telescopes? Eddie repeated. Let's order a few from the Quidditch shop. I can transfigure animals to deliver them, Scott said. My transfigurations can move about for a while after I lose direct control. Excellent. Fred and George high-fived. All right, Scott said, pretending to be grave. There's one problem. What? The others asked. Where is the gaunt old house? The twins and Eddie exchanged looks. You don't know? Scott asked, surprised. They shook their heads. Then there's nothing more to say. Give up, Scott said jokingly. Wait, we'll find it, the twins promised at once. Eddie smiled confidently. Who do you think I am? Trust me, this is nothing. Fine, Scott said, smiling. I'll wait for your good news. After the meeting, the twins and Eddie set off to find the gaunt old house, and Scott went back to his studies. He ordered several panoramic telescopes by mail. On Wednesday of the next week, 4 days before the Sunday Medea planned to purify the Horcrux, the group met again. The gaunt old house is in Little Hangleton, Eddie announced. Let's get started. Scott grinned and took several copper-colored binoculars from his deformed lizard skin bag, setting them on the table. The panoramic telescopes arrived today, he said. He'd tested them already. They could function as cameras and replay short stretches of footage. Oh, brilliant. The twins and Eddie crowded around, fiddling with the devices. Scott thought through how they'd place and retrieve the telescopes and how to make everything run automatically. Updates have been inconsistent these past 2 days because I'm a bit stuck on the writing. Please give me a few days to adjust, dear readers. I need to fine-tune the upcoming outline. Chapter 344, Warriors Heading to the Old Gaunt House. The joke prop workshop hid in a secret passage inside Hogwarts. Wind howled through the vents in the ceiling, and a dozen candles burned on several old desks pushed together. On those desks sat a curious device, a panoramic telescope, part camera. Several of them had been unpacked and were being examined with the delight of children discovering a new toy. How come I never knew this existed? It's a telescope and a recorder at once. Magic is incredible, Eddie crowed. We've known for a while, but we couldn't afford one, Fred said. Then we forgot it was within reach when we could afford it, George added with a shrug. Eddie and the Weasley twins were practically ignoring the mission in favor of the toys. Fred held a panoramic telescope to his eye, practically vibrating with excitement. I want to bring this to a match, he said. Imagine viewing the whole pitch and replaying our best hits. I thought the same thing, George said ruefully. If only Gryffindor weren't playing this Saturday. I can record your match for you, Eddie shouted. If you play well, I'll keep the highlights. Of course, the twins cried in unison, puffing up. We are the greatest beaters Gryffindor's ever had. Scott, meanwhile, examined another panoramic telescope more like a student of artifacts than a fan. The device was simple to operate, like a Muggle panoramic camera, with the odd addition of 2 rotating dials for rewinding and adjusting playback speed. Scott's curiosity, however, ran deeper than mere function. If he could pry apart the runic circuits inside and study them, he might be able to turn his listening bats into surveillance bats that both watched and listened, useful not only for gathering secrets but in combat, giving him an extra layer of awareness to complement his magic perception. The merchants of the magical world had other ideas. Alchemical devices typically had built-in secrecy and anti-tamper protections. A flying broom or a joke prop would rarely leave an easy point of entry for someone trying to reverse engineer it. If Scott tried to force the telescope open, those runic circuits might self-destruct. He felt a small measure of luck that his Ravenclaw mentor was a master of alchemy. The man had even made a room of requirement-like chamber. Under such guidance, Scott thought he might actually have a chance. Scott, Eddie, done fiddling with the telescope, called him over. What should we do next? Fred and George looked up at the same time. Next? Scott smiled. First, we scout out the layout of the old Gaunt house. Eddie's face fell. Sorry, that's beyond my abilities. Did you hear that? Fred stage whispered to George. George nodded solemnly. I heard it. What are you two doing? Eddie glared. We're only lamenting, Fred said, dabbing at an imaginary tear. George echoed the gesture in perfect synchronization. Our gossip expert, Mr. Eddie Carmichael, has finally met a mystery he can't dig up. This is tragic, they intoned together. You two are impossible, Eddie protested. If this were the Muggle world, I'd have a detailed map of Little Hangleton without leaving home. This is Hogwarts, George reminded him, turning serious. Fred matched his expression. Yeah, this is above our pay grade. I'll handle it, Scott said. The three looked at him with interest. How? Eddie asked. Scott shook the panoramic telescope in his hands. We'll send a telescope up to reconnoiter. They all nodded in understanding. Then it's your mission, they said together. Scott paused, then agreed. He wondered why he'd let the idea lodge in his head in the first place. But curiosity, and the fact they were already committed, kept him from backing out. One thing's certain, he told them. We're not the only ones watching the Gaunt house. Who knows how many groups will set up in advance? The key is not being discovered. The resurrected witch, the evil dark wizard, the righteous Auror, Eddie muttered, maybe even the headmaster. They'll have aerial guards too, Eddie added, remembering Thestral's missing from Hogwarts. Scott knew that and had planned for it. He intended to use Transfiguration to create an eagle capable of high flight and of carrying the panoramic telescope to scout. The task required the eagle to be clever enough to complete the mission. Simple memory and intelligence would suffice. Unable to use Lambo or his flock of crows, Medea already knew he could command crows. He built a compact persona in his mind, repeating it until he convinced himself the bird would have the necessary instinct and memory. He drew his most compatible ebony wand from the scaly bag at his hip, focused on the persona, and cast the Transfiguration. No runic circuits, no elaborate charms, just pure transfiguration, and the result met his expectations. A majestic eagle settled on the table. In the other's eyes, it was a normal transfiguration. To Scott, it was exactly what he had intended. Is this really okay? Eddie asked uncertainly, eyeing the bird. It looks royal, Fred said, and the eagle cocked its head toward Eddie as if mildly affronted. It seems smart, George said. Scott reached out and smoothed the feathers until the bird settled. It can't understand what you're saying, he told Eddie, but it senses when you don't take it seriously. Eddie laughed. All right, I surrender. You'll finish the job, I promise. Scott picked up the panoramic telescope again. Next, disguise it. People will spot it if it's obvious, Eddie agreed. Even from high up, it could be captured. Scott thought a moment, then flicked his wand again. A piece of ebony wood in his hand shifted and turned into a small, drab, furry rabbit. Disguised as prey? Fred said, pinching the plush's ears. That's inconspicuous. I like it, George grinned. Scott flipped the rabbit over, unzipped a seam in its belly. Eddie snorted when he saw it was hollow, and slid the panoramic telescope inside. The fit was perfect. He fastened the buckle built into the plush, zipped it closed, and left only the two lenses exposed. Ready, Scott said. Fred, open the vent. Fred was already on his broom. Scott gestured upward at the ceiling vent and patted the eagle's flank. Go, champion. The eagle rose, spread its wide wings, and seized the rabbit by the back with powerful talons. It ascended hard toward the ceiling. Fred, hovering, reached in and opened the iron grate. The eagle cried out once, slipped into the duct, and was gone. Eddie craned his neck up. You think it'll work? If we're lucky, Scott said guardedly. Our luck won't be bad, Fred said confidently, and instead of closing the grate as Scott asked, he hovered nearby and high-fived George. So how long do you think that transfiguration will last? George asked. Who knows, Scott admitted. He hadn't specifically stress-tested the charm. At least 24 hours, conservatively. That's enough for a round trip. Then we'll come back here same time tomorrow, Fred decided, and see if our champion returns. A few more logistical details were hashed out, then the four left the workshop and returned to the castle. The twins parted ways, and Scott and Eddie headed for Ravenclaw Tower. On the corridor, they nearly ran into Caccini, Roger's ex, surrounded by a cluster of Hufflepuff girls. "Hello, Scott, Eddie," she said with a half-smile. "Hello, Caccini," Scott replied, surprised. He hadn't seen her in a while, and what he saw made him pause. The once somber, artful girl had undergone a dramatic transformation. Her long black hair was cut short and streaked with bright colors. Smoky eye makeup and black lipstick framed her face. She wore extravagant jewelry, even a nose and lip ring. Where a graceful music student once stood, now swaggered a punk, so thorough a change it left Scott blinking. "If Eddie hadn't nudged me, I wouldn't have recognized her," Scott murmured as the group passed. "It's probably Roger's doing," he added under his breath. "What?" Eddie turned, incredulous. "Wasn't slapping Roger enough?" Scott shrugged. "I don't know. I can't predict what she'll do. Her magic has changed a lot." Eddie's eyes widened. Could she be? Scott saw where Eddie was heading. The Miss Poison doll he'd mentioned before. "Your imagination's exaggerated," he said with a smile. "No matter her style, Caccini is still Hufflepuff." Eddie relaxed and let out a relieved sigh. "Good. I was worried the old Hufflepuff tradition against producing dark wizards was gone." Scott chuckled. "It's not that dramatic. Let Roger worry about this." He could tell she meant no harm, and that the essence of her magic hadn't shifted into anything malicious. With that, Scott's guilt over once impersonating Roger with polyjuice faded. Eddie, grinning, added mischievously, "Maybe he's finally met his match." They both laughed. Thinking back over the last few years, Eddie admitted he'd secretly wanted someone to put Roger in his place. The next afternoon, after classes ended, Scott and the others returned to the practical jokes workshop in the secret passage. The eagle he had sent out the day before had already come back. Fred scooped up the plush rabbit it was carrying and pulled out a panoramic telescope. "Let me see," he said, raising it to his eye and turning the dial with practiced fingers. "Forget it, Fred," George laughed. "Can you find little Hangleton in that playback?" "Who says I can't?" "I've studied the map," Fred protested. George snorted. "Take your time, then." Scott ignored the twins' squabbling and reached out to touch the eagle's feathers anyway, letting his magic sweep over it. "I didn't expect it to still be this stable after a day," he said to Eddie. "I couldn't keep it like this." Eddie stared with envy as the bird stood a little straighter under Scott's touch. "If I transfigure an animal, I can keep it only an hour at most. Once it gets beyond my magical range, it can't move on its own." Scott shrugged. "I already told you the method for advancing in Transfiguration." "Even if I know the method, I can't do it," Eddie said, sounding helpless. At that moment, Fred gave up and pushed the telescope toward Scott. "All right, I really can't find it," he admitted. "You do it." "This is Eddie's thing," Scott said with a smile. "He's got the eye for this." Eddie beamed and took the telescope proudly. Observation and recall were a talent in themselves. As he started working the device, Scott chatted with the twins. "What have you been inventing lately?" he asked. "We've been working on fireworks," Fred said, pulling a grubby notebook from a desk. "Also portable swamps. We think Filibuster's fireworks can be improved," George said. "We'll make something better." They set their tools and materials out and crowded over a battered cauldron, muttering formulas and triggering the occasional small pop and puff of smoke. "This won't do," Fred muttered, scribbling. "Try again." George produced a bottle of strange mineral powder. Scott set his gaze on a fresh panoramic telescope and tried to probe its internal magical circuits with his senses. "Oh, got it!" Eddie suddenly exclaimed. "That's Little Hangleton, a rundown little village." Fred and George abandoned their tinkering and clustered around. "Is Gaunt's old house there?" Fred asked. "They must be down on their luck if they're living in a shoddy place." "More rundown than ours?" George wondered. "Maybe, or about the same," Fred laughed. "But the burrow's still the most interesting home I've seen." Eddie peered at the shaky aerial image. "It's an overview. The camera wobbles, and there aren't many people. Look for abandoned houses." He twiddled the dial to change the playback speed. "I see 2 empty houses." Scott's mind immediately filled in the names from the original story. Gaunt Old House and Riddle Manor. Eddie handed the panoramic telescope over. "I've fixed the view," he said. Fred studied it for a moment. "That broken house in the thicket. Gaunt probably can't afford that big place on the hill." George grabbed the telescope and squinted. "There's a snake nailed to the door of that rundown house." "You've got good eyesight," Fred said. "The entrance is almost completely overgrown." "Give it here," Scott said, reaching for the telescope. "I need to draw a map." He held the telescope in one hand and drew his wand across a sheet of parchment with the other. As he shifted the image back and forth, black lines sprang from the tip of his wand and spread over the paper. The basic layout of Little Hangleton sketched itself out. Then the lines filled in detail and even labeled landmarks. Scott set the map down. That should be about right. They leaned over the map and circled possible camera sites. Here, Eddie said, pointing near Gaunt's house. "We can hide one in a tree." "Over here," Fred suggested. "We can disguise a telescope in the undergrowth." "It's a bit far, but safer," George added, tapping another spot. Scott pointed to the abandoned Riddle Manor. "That could work too. Someone could be hiding there." After a lot of arguing and rearranging, they finalized a plan. Fred marked the chosen locations in red. "We need 7 panoramic telescopes altogether," he said. "Lucky you bought 10, Scott." Scott took the remaining telescopes out and set them on the table. "I need to think about deployment," he said. 7 eagles flying out with rabbits carrying cameras is going to look suspicious. At the mental image of 7 eagles and 7 rabbits, the 3 of them burst out laughing. "Then wait until night," Eddie suggested. "No one will see them after dark." Scott checked his pocket watch. "Let's eat first, then do it in the Forbidden Forest. If 7 eagles head straight out of Hogwarts, someone will notice." He slipped the 7 telescopes into his lizard skin bag. The extras could stay behind. Then he touched his wand to the bird and transfigured it back into a block of ebony. Fred waved his wand at the candles on the table and clipped them out, knocks, and they prepared to leave. With wands out for light, they closed the workshop door and took the slide to find the battered flying broom to carry them up. Eddie, still fretting, broke the silence. "Even if we get the footage, what then? These cameras can't be transferred, edited, or played elsewhere. How are we supposed to make money?" "You just realized that?" Scott laughed. Fred said, "We're not doing this for money." George shrugged. "We want to see if the witch and the Dark Lord actually show up and whether they'll fight." Eddie stared. "You don't care about profit?" he asked Scott. "I don't know yet," Scott admitted. "I'm trying to understand the telescope's magical circuits. If I can figure out how the data is stored, maybe we could extract or duplicate it." Eddie lit up. "Then leave it to you. You have to figure it out." Fred and George leaned in. "We want to see the magical circuits too," said Fred. "But we can't take one apart. They'll self-destruct if tampered with." Scott nodded. "I'm trying to bypass the protections with my magical senses. I've got a lead." The twins slapped Scott's shoulders in excitement. "With that, we can invent so many things," they said, eyes bright. After a quick dinner in the Great Hall, the 4 made their way to the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Scott stopped and glanced toward the dark trees. "Hagrid and Professor Grapeland are both in the forest. Let's wait a bit." "Doing what?" Eddie asked. "Not dating," Fred said. "I'd be sick if they were." Scott closed his eyes. "Hagrid's with some creature, maybe a centaur. Grapeland's with a thestral. They're both at the edge. Let's avoid them." He led them around the teachers and deeper into the trees, preferring to chance Hagrid than the unpredictable Professor Grapeland if they were seen. Finally, they reached a small lake and stopped. "Let's do it here." Scott set out the telescopes and brought out the ebony blocks. He had to create 7 distinct personas. Before, the eagle he'd made only needed to remember a route. These birds would have to know their observation points, hide the telescopes, and switch them on at the appointed time. The work took concentration. The others stood quietly, illuminating his workspace with wand light. Once Scott had the personas committed to memory, he moved his wand. Transfigurative light washed over each block, and they reshaped one by one into eagles. When the 7th finished, Scott smiled. "Go, warriors. Complete your mission." The birds cried out, each seized a panoramic telescope, and launched into the night, wings beating away from the lake and melting into the dark sky. 346. Unprecedented conflict. By the weekend, the atmosphere in Hogwarts had grown restless. Everyone was talking about what Medea had announced in her interview a week earlier. If what she'd said was true, something sensational would happen at the gaunt old house on Sunday, something that could shake the British wizarding world. Eddie and the Weasley twins were already exploiting the excitement. They'd quietly set up an underground betting ring and were taking wagers from a steady stream of students. Early Saturday morning, Scott went to the room of requirement and walked into Helena's study. "Morning, Helena," he said as he closed the door. Helena was in one of the paintings, scissors in hand, snipping at the leaves of a potted plant. No matter how many leaves she cut, the plant in the painting remained unchanged. The trimmed bits simply vanished. Still, she kept at it. "Morning," she replied without looking at him. Scott waited by the landscape painting that led deeper into the room. "Hogwarts is buzzier than usual," he said. Helena turned and looked at him with bright curiosity. "I heard Medea is going to duel with that descendant of the Dark Lord?" Scott answered. "She announced it in the paper. Maybe she'll go. Maybe the other side won't. Everything will be settled after tomorrow." Helena scrunched her nose. "Too bad I can't leave Hogwarts, but I don't want to go see." She meant the painting Helena, the ghostly girl who often behaved as if she'd been born stubborn. Scott smiled. After spending so much time with her, he knew she was rarely straightforward. She dropped the scissors, hitching up her skirts, and stepped out of one painting, moving through another until she stood within the landscape painting in front of him. "Aren't you curious, Scott?" she asked, turning to face him. "Curiosity won't help," he said. "We only have to wait. The truth will come out after tomorrow." Helena studied him with suspicion. "I always feel like you're holding something back," she said. "You haven't tried to get first-hand information? Or kept an eye on that place secretly?" Scott put on a helpless expression. "You overestimate me, Helena. I'm just a student. I can't do that much." "Who knows?" she insisted. Then, more loudly, "Are you worried about your friend Medea?" "Who, me worry?" Helena raised her voice. "I've cut off all ties with her." "Is that so?" Scott replied nonchalantly. The landscape painting swung aside, revealing the door to the inner room. "Hurry in. Don't keep Mother waiting," she called in an urgent tone. "Thanks for the reminder. I'll go," he said, and pushed through the door. "Good morning, Mentor," Scott said as he entered. "Morning," Ravenclaw replied from the painting on the far wall. He bowed to his mentor, then took a seat at the desk, pulling several notebooks from a lizard-skin satchel at his waist. As usual, he consulted Ravenclaw on his academic questions. After working his way through his regular studies, Scott flipped to the last page of his Ancient Runes notebook and produced a panoramic telescope from his bag. He explained the device's functions to Ravenclaw and showed her the rune diagrams he'd managed to decipher. "These are the runes I could piece together, but they're incomplete. I can't form a proper rune circuit yet." Ravenclaw smiled slightly. "Do you know it's wrong to just decipher someone else's work like this?" "I know," Scott said, surprised she'd brought it up. He'd never been a moral paragon. Why would she lecture him about ethics now? Her smile deepened. "I don't mean morals," she said. "I mean method." "Method?" he asked. "It's an alchemist's custom," Ravenclaw explained. "You can reverse engineer another alchemist's product to learn its rune circuits, but you should do so by the alchemist's method, by safely disassembling it." Would they leave a back door? Scott wondered. These are commercial products. "If the maker is a legitimate alchemist, there will be a way," she said. "It's an unwritten rule among alchemists. There's another. Even if you decipher a rune circuit, you mustn't recreate the same product." "I'm not an alchemist," Scott protested. "You're an alchemist's apprentice," Ravenclaw corrected. He grinned. "I won't make the same product." "You're not easily bound by rules," she observed lightly. They worked together on the rune circuit. Items like the panoramic telescope rarely contain a single circuit. Instead, several circuits nest and interlock, making them far more complex than the rune work Scott had handled before. Runes must be exact. A tiny mistake can collapse the whole system, so he needed Ravenclaw's guidance. She never gave him answers outright. She guided him to think, to learn the methods and problem-solving approaches. Scott valued that more than a quick solution. The work took the better part of the day, and by evening they were still untangling the layers. Back in the Ravenclaw common room that night, the usually quiet space felt unusually lively. Voices were louder than normal. "Scott!" Eddie waved from the window seat. Scott joined his roommates. "What's going on?" he asked. "Did Gryffindor and Slytherin start fighting?" Eddie grinned. "Yes, you missed it. You'll regret not being there." "Why?" Scott said, unconcerned. "I've seen them spar before." Roger clapped him on the shoulder. "Not like this. Most students from Slytherin and Gryffindor got involved." Milton shook his head. "It got out of hand. Even the professors didn't have time to stop it," Eddie explained. "They had a Quidditch match in the morning. Tensions built on the field. Slytherin was fouling. Gryffindor retaliated. After Gryffindor won, Slytherin wouldn't let it go. It started with Malfoy provoking Potter. And then it spread," Roger added. "Gryffindor used Medea's interview to taunt the pureblood Slytherins." "Fights popped up everywhere," Milton said. "Professors broke up several scuffles, but the students who were taken to offices came back out still ready to brawl. And Fred and George, while the Slytherin troll captain was in the loo, threw dung bombs with fireworks into his stall," Eddie recounted. "The twins bolted, and the troll gave Ron a proper thrashing," Roger said sympathetically. "Percy got involved," Milton said. "I never thought the proper head boy would fight. He used a charm on Flint that made his ears shrink, and he smelled like a troll all day." "By afternoon, it was a full-on showdown," Eddie said. "The hospital wing's full." Scott realized how much he'd missed holed up in the room of requirement for a day. "Sounds like Gryffindor and Slytherin lost a lot of house points," he said, smiling. Eddie laughed. "That's the first thing I thought when it started." "Same," Roger and Milton agreed. "Just waiting for tomorrow," Eddie said, excitement in his voice. "Tomorrow is the Witch versus the Dark Lord's appointment." "I wonder how the Evening Prophet will cover it," Roger said. Scott glanced at Eddie, then the two exchanged a look. "I haven't told them about what we prepared," Scott said with a half-smile. Eddie's eyes said, "I want them to be surprised." "I actually hope they don't fight," Milton murmured. "If they do, it could spiral into a war." Eddie and Roger fell quiet. Though none of them had lived through the previous Wizarding War, the stories of its horror had deeply marked the new generation. Some of their relatives had died in it. "Dumbledore will be there, right?" Eddie said hopefully. "Maybe he can capture both the Witch and the Dark Lord's Death Eaters in one swoop." Milton was skeptical. "You don't really believe that. The Witch is clever. She won't go in unprepared." Roger remembered his own run-in with Medea and nodded. "Since she announced it publicly, she's already made her preparations." "We'll see when the news comes," Scott said, calmer than the others. "The wizarding world won't plunge into chaos, at least not yet." His roommates looked at him, asking without words why he was so certain. "Chaos wouldn't serve Medea's interests, nor Dumbledore's, nor the Ministry's, nor most people's," Scott explained. Milton frowned. "But the Dark Lord and his followers could still try to cause chaos," he said. "All of Voldemort's Horcruxes have been destroyed," Scott replied. "He can't act like before. He's too afraid of death." "That makes sense," Roger said. "If the Horcruxes are in Medea's hands, I don't think Voldemort can stop her from destroying them, or take them back. The witch is smart and powerful," Eddie added. "I don't think she'll lose this time." Scott thought Voldemort himself would probably avoid appearing until he'd fully returned to power. More likely, he'd send Death Eaters to retrieve his Horcruxes if he could. All of that, though, was conjecture. Scott couldn't be certain whether Voldemort had resurrected. He could only make guesses based on the Dark Mark's magic fluctuations and whether Harry was having dreams, but even those signs weren't infallible. On Sunday morning, Scott and Eddie went to the hospital wing. Eddie peered in through the doorway. "All the beds are full," he said. "You knew that already," Scott teased and stepped inside. Sure enough, every bed was occupied by students from Gryffindor or Slytherin. Even lying down, they were noisy. The two houses lay in distinct rows, glowering across the aisle at one another with clear hostility. 347. Treeman and Blumen. When Scott and Eddie reached the door of the ward, every head turned. The Gryffindors and Slytherins inside still wore the hard expressions of old enmities. Under those stares, Eddie, who was walking in front, stopped. Scott didn't hesitate. He stepped past Eddie and walked into the ward. He glanced around casually, and any Slytherins who met his gaze quickly looked away. "Hey, Scott, Eddie, you here to see me?" Fred called from the innermost bed, raising a bandaged hand. "Why didn't you bring a gift?" George, on the bed next to him, complained, feigning disappointment. Scott smiled and moved further in. He greeted Harry, who lay on the bed near the door. Passing Percy's bed, he paused, surprised at the head boy's flushed face. Percy immediately buried his head under the blanket. "Oh, don't peek. Percy's going to be broken-hearted," Ron said from the bed next to him, his face still streaked with boils. "He's afraid McGonagall will strip him of head boy for fighting." He grinned and accidentally scratched one of the boils, yelping a couple of times. Percy stuck his head out, glaring. "Who do you think I was fighting for? If I hadn't saved you, you'd have been blasted by a knockback jinx, you idiot." Ron mumbled back, "Who told you to save me?" "What did you say?" Percy snapped. Ron tried to reply, but a flying pillow struck his head. "Shut up, Ron," Ginny's voice ordered. Scott's gaze swept over the 5 Weasleys lined up together, and he couldn't help but laugh. "Every one of you is talented," he said, smiling as he walked between George and Fred. "Thanks for the compliment." Fred and George answered in unison, pride written on their faces. "That's so silly," Ginny muttered, burying her face in her hands. "Ha-ha, hiss." Ron managed 2 more strained laughs. "What are you going on about? Who rushed forward when they saw Harry hit with a charm?" Ginny sprang up, snatched her pillow from Ron, and smacked him with it. "I said shut up!" "Nice going, Ginny," Fred and George cheered on. "Harder, hit him harder." From across the room, Malfoy muttered, "Like a lunatic." "Shut up, Malfoy," Harry snapped from the doorway. Ginny sank back onto her bed, cheeks flushed, but Malfoy continued, barbed. "Defending your girlfriend, Potter? Maybe you can marry the Weasley madwoman with whatever's left of the Potter fortune. That'll secure their family's future." Slytherins laughed. Harry, sitting up now, glared at Malfoy, too angry to reply. Ginny began to cry, outraged. "Looks like you haven't learned your lesson, Malfoy." Fred shouted, "Say one more word, and I'll pull out your tongue." George threatened. The ward erupted into a volley of insults from Gryffindors and Slytherins alike. Scott and Eddie exchanged a look, then sat on stools and watched the commotion. Madame Pomfrey burst in before it could escalate further. "Quiet. If you make any more noise, I'll have your dean take you away and dock 100 points from each of you." Her voice left no room for argument. In the school hospital, she was absolute authority. Heads immediately bowed and silence fell. Once she turned to leave, Fred leaned close to Scott and Eddie. "The rest is up to you." He waved his bandaged right hand. The skin had taken on the appearance of rough, old tree bark. "We might not be out until the day after tomorrow. This place is so boring," he complained. George scrubbed at his face, now blue and scattered with small scales. "If there's any news, tell us, will you? Keep us updated." "All right, Mr. Treeman, Mr. Blueskin," Scott said, "but I don't think you'll be bored in here." "It's lively," Eddie added. "If Madame Pomfrey wasn't watching, you'd be at each other's throats in no time." "Our wands were confiscated by Professor McGonagall," Fred said. "We'll have to write a 12-inch self-criticism to get them back." "Maybe you could make branches grow from your arm to whip us," Scott joked. "Good idea. What about me?" George asked expectantly. "Just open your mouth and bite. Right now you look like a poisonous snake," Scott replied. "Don't call me a snake," George protested. "A blue poison dart frog, then?" Eddie suggested. "Better," George admitted. Scott and Eddie didn't stay long. "That set of charm circuits isn't figured out yet." "I have to keep working on it," Scott told Eddie, then left and went up to the 8th floor, slipping into the room of requirement. "Good morning, Scott." Helena in the portrait greeted him proactively. "Good morning," Scott said. "You seem cheerful." "Not bad." She was a little distant as she walked into the landscape painting in front of him. "Today is when Medea destroys the last Horcrux, isn't it?" she asked. Scott nodded. "That's what she announced in the papers." The painting swirled open and Helena fell through without another word. Scott didn't open the room immediately. Curiosity made him ask, "Has Dumbledore gone? Why do you ask me?" Helena turned back. "The portraits know so much. You always have good news," Scott said. "Dumbledore isn't in the castle. He hasn't been since yesterday," she replied, then stepped into the painting. Scott entered the inner room and, with guidance from Ravenclaw's portrait, set about parsing the charm circuitry the panoramic telescope had recorded. "This isn't a new kind of charm circuit," Ravenclaw told him. "The main circuit existed in our era. Alchemical devices once recorded events, but we lacked panoramic telescopes, and the circuits were not as complete as this." She briefly touched on history and then focused on the circuitry Scott had decoded. The core is a record circuit, nested with loop, speed, and control. "There are actually 4 different circuits in this set," she said, then began to describe them clearly. "You've already learned the simplest one, speed." By noon, Scott had reconstructed the complete set. Then he and Ravenclaw discussed how to transfer, store, and edit the recorded images. Ravenclaw offered a few creative suggestions. This was unfamiliar work for her, and Scott left with enough to test. He had lunch in the Great Hall, visited Professor Babbling for his weekly consultation. Ravenclaw's mentor strongly encouraged him not to abandon this. "Times move forward. Each mind brings different wisdom," Ravenclaw had said. Babbling's insights into ancient runes complemented Ravenclaw's teaching, so Scott kept the habit. Afterward, he went to the Weasley twins' joke shop workshop down the secret passage, hoping to borrow some tools to experiment with the charm circuit's transfer and editing functions. It took until dinner before he made real progress. After dinner, Scott and Eddie walked toward the Forbidden Forest together. "I can't believe neither the Daily Prophet nor the Evening Prophet printed anything about that incident," Eddie grumbled. "Do you think the Ministry is covering it up?" "Who knows?" Scott said. "We'll find out when our champions return." Eddie wasn't hopeful. If the panoramic telescopes were found, maybe they were destroyed already. "There's nothing we can do about that now. It'll come down to luck." "Hope we get lucky," Eddie said. They cut through the garden behind the castle. Scott stopped at a bush and called, "Good evening, Mr. Treeman, Mr. Blueskin." 2 cloaked figures slipped out from behind the shrubbery. "Good evening." It was Fred and George, hooded and trying to look inconspicuous. "Why are you 2 out here?" Eddie asked. "Our symptoms don't stop us from moving around," George said, stretching his legs. "It's just this hand of mine that's awkward," Fred added, holding up the bark-like limb. "Afraid of Madame Pomfrey?" Scott warned. "She might brew the nastiest potion for you if she finds out." "No way," George said, the blue of his face ghostly under his hood. "Her potions are already nasty enough. They can't get worse," Fred countered. "We might have to wait a long time in the forest," Eddie reminded them. "Those eagles might not be back tonight. The duel between that witch and the Dark Lord could be tonight." "We want to see it ourselves," Fred and George insisted. "We snuck out pretending to go to the loo," Fred said. "Percy, Ron, and Ginny don't know. If you don't come back for ages, Madame Pomfrey will tell McGonagall," Eddie warned. "Mom would probably just send a howler or a good scolding when we get home," George shrugged. "She's used to this. She's got more to worry about." "Then what are we afraid of?" Fred said, and they quickly talked themselves into going on. At the forest edge, Scott checked for life within his perceptual range. "There's nobody nearby," he said, drew his wand, and led the way. "You 2 stay behind me. In the forest, I'll keep the widest range of perception." He flicked his wrist. "Lumos." Eddie cast Lumos too. Fred and George, wandless, fell in step behind them. After a while, Scott whispered, "Extinguish." They snuffed the light. "Someone, non-wizards," Scott murmured. "Very fast. That fluctuation, centaurs, will go around." They moved cautiously in the dark. Scott recognized the pattern of 3 centaurs moving in the nearby woods. They were quick and erratic, and every time Scott tried to skirt them, the centaurs shifted, preventing them from passing. "I don't know what they're doing," he told the others. "Maybe hunting?" Eddie guessed. "No, this is the edge of the Forbidden Forest," Fred said. "There's nothing here to interest them." George added. "Watch your step and hurry," Scott said. "We should get past them." Hooves thundered as the centaurs increased their pace. Arrows whistled through the air. Scott shoved Eddie and the twins aside and roared, "Protego!" He threw up a shield. 3 arrows struck the invisible barrier with a clang. "Lumos!" Eddie's wand lit the area just then. "Engorgement charm!" Scott shouted, leveling his wand at a nearby stone and swelling it to block another arrow. "Stop! We are Hogwarts students," someone yelled from the wood. "Stop quickly. They're young wizards," a deeper voice called. "Who knows if they are?" another voice answered. "Subdue them first." Is that their idea of subduing, shooting holes in us? Fred protested. Do not harm Hogwarts students, Eddie shouted back. We see clearly. They look underage, Hogwarts children, one centaur observed. Scott felt a centaur approach. This one stepped closer to examine them, and then retreated a pace, sounding warning. Leave. Tonight the Forbidden Forest welcomes no outsiders. What's going on? Eddie asked. You must leave, said a voice more insistently. This is Hogwarts' Forbidden Forest. No one is to enter. Fred leaned in and whispered to Scott, Can you teach them a lesson? Maybe we have to beat them before we can get to the lake. Eddie frowned. It's not worth the trouble. Let's find another way. What other way? Give up? Fred spat. The twins clearly didn't want to turn back. Leave the forest now, a voice warned more sharply, and an arrow thudded into the earth at Scott's feet. Something's wrong, Scott said. They're more aggressive than usual. Fred and George exchanged looks. They'd snuck into the forest many times, but never faced centaurs this volatile. We're going to the lake, Scott announced loudly. We have business there. Go back to your castle, the annoyed voice replied. You are forbidden to be here. We won't leave, Fred and George said. They took a couple of steps forward, and 2 arrows buried themselves by their feet with whistling sounds. We are not joking, one centaur said. We will shoot your legs. Such injuries are easily healed. The twins froze. Hooves thundered again, and 3 large centaurs emerged from different directions, encircling the group. One held a bow trained on them. Since you won't leave, we will tie you with ropes and return you to the castle, he said. Don't be so hasty, Bane, another centaur interjected. He stepped forward and introduced himself, surprisingly calmly. Hello, my name is Firenze. Scott said. Eddie, Fred, George. They offered their names. Firenze looked up at the sky, then back down at them with a serious expression. He narrowed his eyes, raised his bow, and fixed his gaze on George. You are not a young wizard. His voice cut through the night. He stared at George's blue, scaly face. Who are you? Bane, standing nearby, snorted. What kind of half-breed is that? Something married to a wizard? Fred couldn't help himself and laughed. Of course I'm a witchling, George snapped, then pulled back his hood to show the altered skin plainly. I just got hit by a charm. The 3 centaurs kept watching him, suspicion writ plain on their faces. He is my brother. We're twins. Fred pulled back his hood and added, he just got hit by a curse. Bane's eyes flicked again to Fred's frozen right hand. Twins? Firenze stared at Fred and George for a long moment, then lowered his bow. Looking closely, the 2 of them really did look identical. Hagrid mentioned a pair of very mischievous twins at Hogwarts, he said. That must be you. That's us. Fred and George shot their hands up at the same time. There are only 2 twins here at the school, and nobody's more mischievous than we are. They announced this with proud, mock-regal pomp, as if accepting an award. Firenze motioned to the other centaurs to lower their bows and arrows as well. You should go. Leave the Forbidden Forest. You're not safe here tonight. Did a dark wizard sneak in? Eddie blurted. Don't waste time talking to them, Bane snapped to Firenze. They won't listen. If something happens to them, that's not our responsibility. Another centaur agreed. Bane's right, Firenze. We cannot harm them, but we are under no obligation to keep them safe. They're not adults yet, Firenze protested. That's not our concern, Bane said gruffly. We warned them. Scott felt more uneasy than ever. Was something major about to happen in the forest tonight? Firenze looked at Scott and his friends again. Scott glanced around. Eddie and the twins were all looking to him, clearly waiting for a decision. We'll leave, Scott decided. He wasn't the sort to court trouble unnecessarily. All right, Firenze said. I will escort you to the edge of the forest. Scott raised his wand. Flock of birds. Caw, caw. A rough chorus of ravens burst from the tip of his wand, scattering into the night and shedding black feathers as they circled. I'll trouble you, Mr. Firenze, Scott said. These ravens will keep watch. The flock dispersed into the darkness, only one raven staying to perch on Scott's arm. They followed the centaur's guidance toward the forest's edge. Scott casually tore a leaf, touched it with his wand, and wrote a message on it. He had to entrust Lambo with the job of waiting for the 7 hawks to return and retrieving the panoramic telescope. Give it to Lambo, he whispered. The raven took the leaf in its beak and flew off. Raven intelligence didn't comprehend words, but they knew names. Until they reached the forest's edge, nothing else happened. The centaurs turned and melted back into the trees. Scott and the others stood at the boundary, peering into the black maw of the forbidden forest. "What do we do?" Eddie fretted. "Have all our plans been wasted?" "Not necessarily," George said. Eddie looked at him. "He means the panoramic telescopes might not be back, or if they are, they could be damaged," George added. "Don't worry, I've made arrangements." Scott waved his wand. Whoosh! Flapping wings rose again as another band of ravens streamed out of the forest, then turned and flew deeper in. "If the hawks come back, they'll help guard it." "I hope so," Eddie said, watching the flock fade, clearly unconvinced about the ravens' fighting ability. "Let's go." Scott turned toward the castle first. "Aren't you curious what will happen in the forest tonight?" Fred asked, excitement in his voice. Eddie immediately brightened. "A dark wizard must have slipped in, and the centaurs are readying to fight." "It's probably not that simple," George disagreed. "All the centaurs we saw seemed agitated." "Want to see for yourself?" Scott stopped, dug into a small bag at his waist, and pulled out a panoramic telescope. "Don't forget, we can use this." George brightened. "I'd love to." Fred and Eddie nodded. Scott produced a slender piece of ebony and, with a flick, turned it into an owl. He switched the panoramic telescope on and strapped it to the bird. The owl hooted, took the telescope in its talons, and flew toward the forbidden forest. "It'll patrol above the trees," Scott said. "If it hears anything, it'll fly closer, and the telescope will record what happens." Back in the castle, Scott and Eddie parted from the Weasley twins and made for Ravenclaw Tower. "I thought Fred and George might stay to watch," Eddie said. "They're always curious." "They're not stupid," Scott replied. "Fred and George are clever." Eddie grinned. "Let's just hope Madame Pomfrey doesn't catch them red-handed." They arrived at the Ravenclaw common room, where Eddie's small circle of Quidditch strategists was gathered. Scott decided on a quick bath in the prefect's bathroom. Refreshed and nearing curfew, he returned to find fewer people around. Luna sat on the sofa by the fire and called, "Scott." He crossed the room, set his bathing basket down, and sat opposite her. "What is it?" "Something happened," Luna said, wide-eyed and oddly ethereal, her bare feet peeking from beneath her nightgown. "What?" Scott asked. "In the forbidden forest." She turned toward the window. "I saw it. There was a battle." "You can see that far?" Scott asked, surprised. "I didn't see much," Luna admitted. "I only know there was a battle." She hopped off the sofa, padded to the window, then bounced on the floor for a moment before running back for her slippers. Scott went to the window with her. "It was right there, but it's over now," she said, pointing to a patch of the forest. Scott studied the black expanse and realized it was probably where they'd met the centaurs earlier. "Do you know who was involved?" Luna shook her head. "I don't know. I can't see who fought whom." "How can you tell there was a battle?" Scott asked. "I saw it." Luna peered at him as if the answer were obvious. Scott thought for a few seconds and then understood. "You don't see spells or people specifically, more like the idea of a battle?" Luna considered and then nodded. "The little brain bug that lives in my eyes has finally matured. I can see more now." Scott found himself staring at her silver-gray eyes. Fascinated. Was this a special kind of magic? Should he tell Professor Flitwick? "Professor Flitwick would be very pleased to hear you describe it," he said. Luna nodded solemnly, then darted for the door. "I'm going now." Her slippers slapped as she hurried off. Scott sat back down and watched the dark forest. What had actually happened? He waited in silence. A little while later, there was a tapping at the window. He opened it and let the owl carrying the panoramic telescope in. Scott waved his wand and turned the owl back into a wooden block, took the telescope, and began to play back its recording. His fingers spun the dial, and the images reversed, sweeping from the common room back into the forest. He had to concentrate. The night was dark, and the images faint. The image suddenly brightened, a red charm flaring in the trees. Scott slowed the footage. A hooded wizard came into view fighting a centaur. Because the perspective was from above, the wizard's hood obscured his face. Scott replayed the scene several times. Only one wizard appeared in the forest that night, and the fight was brief, not terribly fierce. There was no clear victor. Neither side was injured. The wizard disappeared by apparition. Scott watched the recording through 2 more full playbacks. He still couldn't tell why the wizard had come or what he'd wanted. Luna came running back, out of breath. "I told Professor Flitwick," she gasped. "Did he believe you?" Scott asked. "Oh, yes." Luna's expression was serious. "He said he would speak with Professor McGonagall and then go investigate." They said goodnight and returned to their dorm. Monday morning, the male owls arrived in the Great Hall, and students waited eagerly for the daily prophet. "I've never been so excited for the prophet," Eddie declared, looking up at the owls. Scott kept a hand over the milk jug to stop feathers falling in. Several papers were dropped on their table. Eddie and Roger snatched them up. Scott picked up his copy and flipped through it. "Nothing! Nothing!" Eddie complained as he rifled the pages. "Did nothing happen yesterday?" Roger asked in disbelief. "Maybe that's a good thing," Milton said weakly. Scott scanned the paper and found no useful reports. "We'll go to the Forbidden Forest again at noon," he told Eddie. "Okay," Eddie said, nodding. Most students at the tables were furious with the prophet's silence. They wanted to read about an epic battle, or at least the latest on the Quidditch World Cup grounds. Slytherins, many of whom were still resentful, demanded an apology from Rita Skeeter for any false exclusives. Gryffindors who hadn't been in the hospital insisted an incident had happened, despite the lack of coverage. Arguments flared across the hall. "Just because it's not in the paper doesn't mean it didn't happen," one Gryffindor insisted. "The Evening Prophet will cover it." "Wait," came cries from others. The noise built, and then Professor McGonagall entered at the Great Hall door. Her presence was like a bucket of cold water on the students' heated faces. The uproar ceased. Her lips were tight, and she scanned the room with a look of stern disappointment, especially lingering on Gryffindor and Slytherin. In an instant, the hall fell silent. "You are here to be students," she said, her voice carrying. "You should be attending classes. Everything else is irrelevant." She nodded once, evidently satisfied, then turned to leave. At the doorway, she added, "A reminder to the students of Gryffindor and Slytherin. Because of your recent misconduct, points from your houses have been deducted." 349. Battle in Little Hangleton. After classes that morning, Scott met Eddie, and they cut across the castle's back gardens to the edge of the Forbidden Forest. This time, they didn't stride straight in. They took a detour to a less visible spot. "I wonder if Professor Dumbledore and the others found anything about the wizard who fought the centaur last night," Eddie said, staring into the forest. After Scott returned to the dormitory last night, Eddie had spent a long time studying the panoramic telescope that had recorded the battle, but they still couldn't identify the attacker. "The two incidents might be connected," Scott said as they stepped beneath the trees. "We just don't have proof yet." "You mean the fight in the Forbidden Forest and whatever happened in Little Hangleton?" Eddie asked. "Yes," Scott answered. "It could be a coincidence, but I don't think so." Eddie nodded. "There aren't that many coincidences. Even though this is the Forbidden Forest, it belongs to Hogwarts," he said. Scott understood. Unless something unusual was happening, few wizards would dare come here. They stopped not far into the trees. Scott had no intention of going deep. After all, a battle had taken place here last night, and the centaurs might still be on high alert. He drew his wand, flicked it, and murmured, "Flock of birds." A scatter of crows burst from the tip of his wand, cawing as they took flight. Scott watched the forest until he heard a louder flapping. A vast cloud of black birds streamed in from all directions. With a piercing caw, a big crow descended and settled on Scott's shoulder. Scott reached up and ruffled its feathers. "If you befriend the King of Crows, you can get help like this," he told Eddie. Eddie stared. "You've hidden a lot of secrets." Scott smiled and said nothing. Eddie, a sensible Ravenclaw, didn't press. "Where are our panoramic telescopes?" he asked, looking around. "Have the eagles still not come back?" Lambo, the crow on Scott's shoulder, cawed again. Several birds detached from the flock, each clutching a panoramic telescope in its talons. They dropped them on the ground before Scott and Eddie. Eddie picked one up eagerly and peered through it. "This is from early this morning," he muttered, his fingers spinning the dial rapidly. Scott squatted and put all the telescopes into his shape-shifting lizard skin bag. "We should go," he said, standing and patting Eddie's shoulder. "We shouldn't linger." All right, Eddie said, still disappointed he hadn't found the footage he wanted. Let's check Fred and George's workshop before afternoon classes. If we don't find it, Scott added, I have to be at the Transfiguration Club tonight, so I'll need you to find and organize everything beforehand. No problem, Eddie said, delighted. They walked quickly back to the castle and reached the third-floor corridor. Eddie tapped the statue of the one-eyed, hunchbacked witch with his wand. Finite incantum, he said. The statue split open, and the two slid down the familiar chute, landing at the bottom. Eddie lit a lumos and sprinted into the workshop, already puffing with excitement. Scott followed, setting his bag down and pulling out the handful of panoramic telescopes. The workshop smelled of old wood and mischief. Eddie had already lit the candles and pulled a few packets of biscuits from a desk. Scott eyed them skeptically. Are you sure those are edible? He asked. They're Fred and George's. Who knows what they put in them? Eddie hesitated, then picked at the packet but didn't indulge. Scott rummaged in his bag and produced a stash of snacks Amelia had given him over the holidays, colorful crisps and a can of cola. Eddie brightened, tore open a bag, and crammed a handful of chips into his mouth. Scott handed him the cola and took a panoramic telescope to his eye. He spun the dial. The footage rewound quickly, daylight sliding back to night. It showed the eagles returning to the forbidden forest just before dawn, and Scott noticed a design flaw. The eagles lost mobility after completing their assigned rounds. They had dropped the telescopes on the ground where they'd first picked them up and remained motionless, completely vulnerable when Lambo and his flock later swooped in. If Scott hadn't had the crows guarding the lakeside, he might never have recovered the devices. He made a mental note of the oversight. He sped the footage until a familiar place appeared. Little Hangleton, the ruined gaunt house and its bleak yard. Scott shifted the playback forward and slowed it as a figure entered the frame. Eddie stifled a shout. There they are, men in green robes. And a witch! Oh, this is... The figure who had apparated into the yard wore a dark green robe. He circled the dilapidated three-room house and went inside. Soon he returned and signaled to the sky. More men in green robes arrived, riding thestrals and pulling a carriage drawn by 4 of the same skeletal mounts. 2 lanterns on the carriage lit the small yard. The first green-robed man bowed and gestured for someone to disembark. A gloved hand emerged from the carriage, gripping his arm for support, and Medea stepped down. She wore a dark green robe trimmed with silver, a black hat turned up at the brim with black tulips and lace, and a sheer black veil over her face that left only her straight nose and sharp jaw visible. Her pale lower face showed blood-red lips, the only bright color. The panoramic telescope recorded no sound, but she spoke. Her lips moved. She swept into the house, followed by several of the green-robed men. The others settled the thestrals and took up positions inside and around the yard. The footage sped up and then brightened. A blood-red light seeped through the cracks in the old house's doors and windows, pulsing like spilled blood. Scott frowned. Medea had started some ritual inside the house. The building shouldn't contain enough power for a full sacrificial rite unless she had a one-time source of extraordinary magic. He didn't have time to think further. The light intensified, and then the battle broke out. Charms flared from all sides as a group of aurors from the ministry arrived and engaged the green-robed men. Though the green-robed faction outnumbered the aurors, they were no match for the ministry's elite, and several of them fell quickly. Just as the aurors prepared to storm the yard, 3 particularly powerful figures in green robes stepped out of the house. They pushed the aurors back, injuring several, and the fight reached a tense stalemate. The aurors couldn't force their way in, and the green-robed defenders couldn't drive them off. Throughout, the red light continued to strobe from within the house. Medea remained unseen. Eddie babbled excitedly. Oh, they're fighting! Why are they aurors? Where's the Dark Lord? Oh, dangerous! More green-robed fighters. This is intense. Then new figures appeared in a flash of apparition light on the other side of the yard. Black-robed wizards, green curses flying wildly from their wands. Death Eaters had arrived, the sky filled with green light, curses slashing through the chaos. Suddenly, the crumbling yard wall shifted, bricks and mortar twisted and knit together until the broken fence became a gigantic python. It slithered forward, thick coils absorbing and deflecting death curses. Dumbledore emerged from the shadows, his wand in hand. The Aurors relaxed for a moment at his arrival. Even the green-robed men and Death Eaters instinctively stepped back. His presence alone was a deterrent, but none fled outright. Dumbledore raised his wand, and the giant python, formed from the wall, mended its damaged segments and surged forward. Its head struck at the Death Eaters, while its tail lashed at the house that still pulsed red light. Dumbledore's spells came in relentless, sweeping arcs. The force of them was hard to name. The way he turned focused strikes into overwhelming area effects was almost like cheating. Under his barrage, Death Eaters and green-robed attackers fell. The remaining defenders threw up shields to protect the house. The surviving Death Eaters began to retreat in disarray. Outside the yard, other Death Eaters panicked and made apparition escapes when they saw the tide turn. At length, the blood-red glow from the house vanished. Medea stepped out and began to speak. Dumbledore paused. The Aurors seized their chance, binding and disarming those already down and confiscating charms. Dumbledore and Medea talked for a moment. What exactly they said was lost to the silent recording. Then they turned on one another and resumed combat. Dumbledore's power once more overwhelmed Medea. She could hold only with help from a few green-robed allies. Then, with one of his spells, Dumbledore shattered a wall of the house. The rubble fell away and revealed a figure inside. The moment Medea saw the figure inside the house, she gave a sharp cry. Several green-robed agents beside her dropped to one knee, thrusting their wands into the ground. A blue stream of light erupted from the soil under their feet, instantly enveloping the small courtyard. At the same time, Dumbledore and Medea raised their wands and fired two red, lightning-fast charms at the black figure almost simultaneously. The green-robed agents cast an anti-apparition charm as Medea attacked. It was clearly a trap she and her men had laid specifically for the black-cloaked figure. It was unusual to see Dumbledore move so quickly to join in. If Scott hadn't known him well, he would have thought Medea and Dumbledore had some unspoken understanding. Under the twin assaults from Medea and Dumbledore, the black figure crumpled without putting up a fight. He only waved his wand once before collapsing, sending a golden cup hurtling out of the courtyard at impossible speed, beyond the range covered by the anti-apparition field. Another black-robed figure materialized nearby, a Death Eater in a mask who snatched the golden cup from the air. The Aurors surrounding the courtyard reacted quickly. Several charm lights flashed at him from different directions. The Death Eater holding the cup had no time to apparate. Instead, he used the same trick as his companion, passing the cup on as fast as he could before he was struck down. Scott could only watch the cup fly out of view. The Aurors turned to intercept it, but their expressions told him they'd failed. The cup had been carried away. Medea in the courtyard watched impassively. She and the green-robed agents did not pursue. Given how coolly she reacted to the loss of the cup, Scott suspected the golden chalice taken by the Death Eater was a fake. Dumbledore ignored the cup as well and moved to seize Medea and her men, seemingly trying to capture them all at once. Then the Thestrals that had been standing quietly in the chaos suddenly shifted, including the four harnessed to the carriage. All of them took flight at once and vanished beyond sight. At the same time, the bone-white wand in Medea's hand gave off a soft white glow. The power of the charms she cast visibly intensified, barely allowing her to hold off Dumbledore's attack. Her green-robed agents used the moment to drop their anti-apparition field and apparat away one by one. Though some were caught by the Aurors behind Dumbledore, most escaped. Soon Medea, too, abruptly disappeared mid-fight. Scott could tell she'd used a prepared portkey to leave. Scott paused the screen, set the panoramic telescope down, and checked his pocket watch. "Eddie," he said to Eddie, who still stared at the panoramic telescope with his mouth open, "it's almost time for afternoon classes." Eddie stammered, "Oh, let me just finish this bit. Was the Horcrux stolen by the Death Eater? The Dark Lord didn't even show up." Scott smiled. The golden cup was probably a fake. The whole thing looks like a trap Medea set for the Dark Lord, and the Dark Lord, coward that he is, didn't keep the appointment. All right, maybe that's it. Eddie finally set the panoramic telescope down. Scott stood up. "Of course, that's only my guess. We only saw this from one fixed angle." He waved his wand to snuff the candle, then tapped Lumos on the tip and added, "Come back after dinner and we'll look at it from every angle. You should be able to make a proper judgment then." "Of course, I'm eager to find out the truth," Eddie said. They left the study, closed the door, and took a battered flying broom to the secluded third-floor corridor. They went their separate ways. Scott hurried to the greenhouses for herbology. Professor Sprout was already there when he arrived. The short, round professor still wore her patched old hat and smiled kindly. "Good afternoon, everyone." "Good afternoon, Professor Sprout," the class replied. "From this lesson on, we won't be introducing new material this term," she said. "With the OWLs coming at the end of the year, we need time to review and organize what we've already learned." Reviewing past year's material was the adjustment most professors were making for the 5th years. "Who can tell me how herbs are classified by their growing environment?" Professor Sprout asked. Many hands shot up. She chose Caccini from Hufflepuff. Caccini now looked like a delinquent girl, brightly dyed short hair and a colder voice when she spoke. Her answers were precise and clipped. Aquatic, those that grow in water, divided into freshwater and saltwater species. Terrestrial, those that grow in soil, further divided into fertile, alkaline, and saline types. Mixed, those that can grow in both water and soil and often take different forms depending on the environment. Medicinal, those that must be grown in specially prepared potion beds. Professor Sprout watched her with encouraging eyes and when she finished, happily awarded Hufflepuff a point. The change in Caccini's appearance and tone didn't seem to surprise the professor. Sprout tossed a few more questions to the class, and once all had been answered, she waved her hand. "Everyone, spread out and find a plant in the greenhouse you struggle with. Review how to handle it based on what you've learned. If you need help, call me." Scott, Roger, and Milton wandered together through the glass houses. "What do you struggle with?" Milton asked, looking around. "I don't like venomous tentacula." Roger grimaced. "Is anything worse than collecting Boobatuber pus?" He kept glancing back toward Caccini. Scott raised an eyebrow. "Are you—" "I'm not, no." Roger hurried to deny it. "I'm just curious." He turned away, unwilling to look back. Scott laughed. "Seems you prefer Caccini's new cool, edgy style to her old goody-two-shoes image." "What a pity," Milton said. "The new Caccini probably wouldn't go back to you." "Go back together?" Roger put on an exaggerated expression, as if he'd heard a joke. "No, I never wanted that. It's just her change is so drastic I'm worried something happened." Scott nodded. He was curious, too, about what had caused Caccini to change so completely. "Does Milton know?" he asked. Milton and Caccini were both in the classical music club and knew each other well. Milton, not terribly popular with girls romantically but well-liked, thought for a moment. "I don't know either. The music she listens to has changed. She used to like classical, now she's obsessed with rock." "Maybe that's the reason," Milton added after a pause. "A change brought on by an obsession with rock." "Impossible," Roger said, shaking his head. Milton shrugged and said no more. Professor Sprout came up to them then. Scott crouched and began loosening soil around a potted leaping toadstool. Roger and Milton pretended to busy themselves. After herbology, Scott and Roger had care of magical creatures with Hagrid. Milton went off to divination. They met Hagrid at the grounds on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. Class hadn't started yet, so they waited. "Where's Miss Grapeland?" Roger asked, fingers stroking the spine of his enormous furry textbook. "She's on leave," Hagrid rumbled when class began. "She'll be back next week." The students, especially the boys, groaned in disappointment. Without Assistant Grapeland, Hagrid tended to get carried away. "Today's lesson is a lovely one," he declared, rubbing his hands together. "I want to introduce you to one of me little darlings. You'll like it, just wait." He strode into the Forbidden Forest, and after a few low growls, he led a colossal creature out. 3 massive heads, 3 drooling maws filled with sharp teeth, a gigantic Cerberus. When it walked on all fours, it towered over Hagrid. Its 3 heads snarled in different directions and let out thunderous roars. The girls near the front turned pale. "This is a little darling," Roger choked. "Are me and Hagrid speaking the same language?" Hagrid calmed the Cerberus with a few soft words. "Aw, that's right, good boy, he won't hurt you." He reached out and stroked each head. Big fluff, middle fluff, little fluff. Stop barking, you're scaring me, students. He pulled some meat from his pocket and fed the creature. In Hagrid's presence, it behaved. All three heads lowered obediently and made low, contented noises. Roger and Cedric whispered, recalling the creature that had guarded the Philosopher's Stone 2 years earlier. Did it not bite Snape? And the boys remarked quietly about Hagrid having once raised acromantulas in the forest, now thankfully gone. Hagrid beamed at the sight of his little darling playing with a huge wooden ball, the three heads taking turns tearing it apart. He looked very proud and for a moment almost misty-eyed. I raised him since he was tiny, he said fondly. Ah, who wants to get up close? Maybe feed him, play with him. At the invitation, every student stepped back. No one raised a hand. Girls shook their heads. Boys muttered that the beast could swallow them whole. Hagrid's cheer faded into awkwardness. No one, he asked in a small voice. There really was no one. Embarrassed, Hagrid forced a smile and briefly rattled off a few facts about Cerberus's habits and characteristics before hastily ending the class. 351. Accident, baby, magic mirror. Hagrid's solo lesson once again revealed his questionable taste and lax safety standards when dealing with magical creatures, and many students were beginning to distrust his teaching. On the walk back to the castle, Roger said to Scott, I hope Professor Grapeland comes back soon. Otherwise, what happened with Lucius Malfoy in care of magical creatures could happen again. Even Cedric, always polite, nodded in agreement. Professor Hagrid doesn't seem to grasp where the safety boundaries are between him and the rest of us. Scott agreed. Hagrid was a good man, but he had a knack for being oblivious to danger. Others were grumbling too. That was reckless. What was he thinking, bringing us so close to a Cerberus? Maybe next time we'll get a dragon, or a troll, or a giant. Back in the Great Hall, most of the Gryffindors and Slytherins who'd been injured earlier had already been discharged from the hospital wing. Fred and George, who'd been chatting with Lee Jordan at the Gryffindor table, jumped up and ran over as soon as they saw Scott. How are you, Scott? They asked in unison, dragging him aside. Did you manage to recover the panoramic telescopes? Their magical injuries had healed. They were no longer in their tree man and blue-skinned states. You've fully recovered? Scott asked with a smile. Fred and George winced. Madame Pomfrey said there were too many of us and we were too noisy, Fred complained, so she insisted Snape give us some special medicine. George made a face. That taste, drinking it was like seeing hell. Never mind that. What about the telescopes? Fred pressed. You mean Eddie? Scott scanned the Ravenclaw table but didn't see him. We haven't seen him, Fred said. All the panoramic telescopes were recovered at noon, Scott told them. I put them in your joke shop, and Eddie's probably there right now. Eddie had likely gone straight to the workshop to gawk at the footage instead of eating. Let's go, Fred said. George nodded eagerly. I still have Transfiguration Club after dinner, Scott said. You two go ahead. I'll meet you later. Fred glanced toward the tables and then suggested, a little sheepishly, maybe we should eat first. You're right, George agreed. The hospital foods ruined my taste buds. They patted Scott on the shoulder and hurried off to the Gryffindor table. Scott smiled and sat at the Ravenclaw table next to Roger and Milton. The conversation there was still about the care of magical creatures lesson and the rare Cerberus. Even Milton was excited. It's valuable to see such a creature, he said. That's what the course is for. Roger shrugged. Yes, if only Hagrid hadn't tried to shove us all close to that thing. Cerberuses are as dangerous as dragons. After dinner, Scott went to the classroom on the second floor for Transfiguration Club. By 7:30, all the students were present, but Professor McGonagall had not shown. The club members exchanged nervous looks. McGonagall being late was almost unheard of. Percy stood up. I'll go check her office. At that moment, a silvery, ethereal cat drifted in and perched on the podium. It was Professor McGonagall's Patronus. Her voice came from the animal. Sorry, students. There have been unexpected events at school and Dumbledore is not present. I must attend to them. Tonight's club is canceled. Please study and discuss on your own if you wish. The cat dissolved into motes of light and scattered. Unexpected events? Scott thought of the battle between the centaur and an unknown wizard in the Forbidden Forest the night before, and wondered whether the professors had found any clues. He stood, intending to meet Eddie and the others in the hidden passage. Percy tried to organize the remaining students for independent study, but a few, like Scott, left. Percy looked a little put out. On the third-floor corridor, by the one-eyed, hunchbacked witch statue, Scott made sure no one watched and opened the Chamber of Secrets passage. He slid down and lit a lumos to find the toy shop door. Inside, the workshop was brightly lit and busy. Eddie and the Weasley twins were hunched over different panoramic telescopes. They looked up, surprised at the entrance. "Time flew by, didn't it?" Eddie said, probably so absorbed in the footage he'd assumed Transfiguration Club had ended as usual. Scott closed the door and sat at an old desk, while Fred and George kept looking through their telescopes. "I have a big discovery," Eddie blurted suddenly. "What?" Scott asked. Eddie pointed at a telescope he'd labeled number 7. "I saw 2 people hiding in a rundown house, not far from the Gaunt house. Riddle Manor." Scott's pulse quickened. "Could you see who they were?" "The light was too poor," Eddie said, shaking his head, "but they were wearing black robes, probably Death Eaters. One even seemed to be holding a baby. It moved. I'm sure it was a real baby." Everyone's attention snapped to him. "A baby? Who'd bring a baby to a place like that?" Fred said incredulously. "For feeding? Maybe Lucius Malfoy has another brother," George joked. "Let me see." Scott took the number 7 telescope from Eddie and peered through it. The image was a still frame of the manor's interior. Scott twisted the dial and rewound it. The scene rolled back to when 2 dark, hooded figures suddenly apparated into the courtyard, the edges of the image flickering with a blood-red glow, the same red light Medea had put in the Gaunt house. That meant these 2 had arrived before the others. They moved into the house quickly. One kept holding something swaddled like a baby. But Scott was certain the baby was Lord Voldemort. He'd attended the appointment, but out of fear of Medea or caution toward Dumbledore's arrival, he'd stayed hidden in the shadows while commanding the Death Eaters from there. Scott fast-forwarded the footage at about 4 times speed until the 2 figures left. He couldn't see details in the gloom, but it made sense. Voldemort had stayed nearby to coordinate the Death Eaters so they could apparate away in order and even seize the Golden Cup in a coordinated effort. Scott paused the image and handed the telescope to an impatient Fred. "Keep looking for details and record anything useful," he said. "I need to prepare for the image editing." He pulled a rectangular mirror from his lizard skin bag and spread out a quill and 3 small bottles, 2 with bright red liquid and 1 with gray powder. George peered. "What's all that?" "Kneasel blood and Fwooper blood and powder from a dead boggart," Scott replied. Eddie and the twins watched closely as Scott poured Kneasel blood into a larger glass vial, added the boggart powder, and stirred with his wand. "This should enhance the rune circuit's sensitivity and expressive power," Scott explained. "It's a set of runes to display images." He wrote runes on the mirror smoothly and quickly, a pattern he'd practiced before. The 3 watched, breath held, as he filled the mirror with intricate sigils. Fred frowned. "It still looks incomplete." "I'm not finished." Scott dipped another quill into the Fwooper blood and wrote in the remaining spaces. "The Fwooper blood is for the sound rune circuits." George's eyes widened. "I was just complaining the telescopes had no sound." Scott finished the last runes and then took a bottle of mercury and a particularly thick quill. With the mercury quill, he drew complex arcs across the mirror. When the final stroke landed, the scattered runes linked and began to glow faintly. Scott pointed his wand at the edge of the mirror. The runes flared golden, then quickly faded. The runic markings vanished, leaving a perfectly smooth silver surface. "Did it work? How do we use it?" Eddie asked. Fred picked up the mirror and fumbled with it. "This could be an alchemy piece," he said, grinning, "even though we didn't use alchemy." Scott set the other items aside, straightened the mirror, and smiled. "Now comes the miracle." He pressed his wand against the number 1 telescope. A thread of silver filigree flowed from the telescope to the wand, and Scott flicked it so the filament lay across the mirror's face. Where it touched, hidden runes faintly traced themselves, and the filament dissolved. Black spread across the silver surface like ink in water until an image surfaced. "Oh," Eddie and the twins exclaimed together. "It's like a pensieve." "A bit like a pensieve," Scott acknowledged. He tapped the image with his wand, and the still picture began to play. First, green robes descended into the gaunt old house's yard in Medea's carriage. Scott slid his wand left, and the image rewound. He slid right, and it fast-forwarded. "This is clearer and easier to use than a TV," Eddie said, amazed. "Of course, this is my magic mirror," Scott said with a touch of pride. "It can play images stored within it, and, more importantly, let me edit and process them." He told the three to check the other telescope footage for anything they'd missed, then began feeding each telescope's footage into the mirror. There were 7 perspectives in total. Scott reviewed them all and pieced the events together. Medea had set a trap, claiming to destroy a Horcrux to lure Voldemort. Voldemort, weakened and cautious, arrived but stayed hidden, directing the Death Eaters to seize the potential Horcrux. Dumbledore and a group of Aurors attempted to intercept, technically aligned, but not a single coordinated force. The result was a 3-way clash. Medea retreated and lost some of her followers. Voldemort, likely, walked away with a golden cup of uncertain authenticity and lost some Death Eaters. Dumbledore and the Aurors failed to capture Medea or Voldemort, suffering injuries, but they captured many Death Eaters and green robes. "The resurrected witch came out worse for wear," Eddie said with a smile. "She planned for that," Scott said. "At this stage, she needs to show she opposes the Dark Lord. Whether she wins or loses the encounter is secondary." "Oh, she wants to prove her public allegiance so people stop suspecting her," Eddie said sharply. Scott smiled. "It's a gradual process. If Azkaban needs new tenants, I'm happy," Fred said with a grin. "Whether they're Death Eaters or green robes, I hope the ones caught are unpleasant fellows." "Like Lucius Malfoy," George added with a laugh. Scott kept working, transferring the 7 views into the mirror and slicing the footage into segments. "This is a major project," he muttered. He dabbled in video editing back in his previous life, but this was new territory. Eddie, meanwhile, was already thinking business. "Can we sell mirrors like this?" he asked. "People would pay a lot for something that can play edited footage. We'd sell a simplified playback-only model," Scott said. "Anyone wanting editing tools would pay more." Eddie's eyes lit up as he started calculating costs and profits. "We could film Fred and Angelina's love story, documentary package, 20 galleons." "Go away," Fred shot back. "My love life doesn't need a film crew." George laughed. "As your brother, I've never witnessed your love, only your crush." "I'll be on a date with Angelina soon enough," Fred said defiantly. "Then you'll need a documentary of your first date," Eddie urged, seizing the chance. 352. Completion, opinion, discovery. After a while of listening to the Weasley twins and Eddie laugh and joke, Scott turned to Eddie. "We can start by making a promotional video for Ravenclaw." "Great idea." Eddie's eyes lit up. Fred and George's faces soured the moment they heard it. They didn't really know what a promotional video was, but that didn't stop them from protesting. "Why Ravenclaw?" Fred called. "Why not make one for Gryffindor first?" George added. Scott kept his head lowered, hands busy with the editing, and answered calmly, "Because I'm a Ravenclaw." "That's not fair," the twins chorused. Scott shrugged. "It's certainly not fair, but unfairness is normal." "Oh, Fred, listen to him." Fred and George traded sarcastic comments. "He's absolutely unbearable when he talks." "Seriously, why not make one for the whole school?" George said. "Too narrow-minded," Fred scoffed. "This is house discrimination." "Making a promotional video for Hogwarts." Scott smiled. "You two can take care of the Slytherin section, then." "No need," Fred said quickly. "We're not very familiar with those Slytherins." George brightened. "It's fine to put Gryffindor second. Making the Ravenclaw video can be practice." Scott smiled, stopped editing, and pulled a parchment roll from his deformed lizard skin bag, handing it to George. "This is the runic circuit I deciphered from the panoramic telescope," he said. "You two try it. See if you can make something fun." He didn't give them the improved version he'd used to make the magic mirror. In the magical world, self-improved knowledge like that is usually exchanged for something of equal value, not freely given. Fred and George knew the rules. They'd been joking, but they hesitated when Scott offered the original circuit. Seeing their reluctance, Scott tossed the parchment in front of them. "Just don't make telescopes with it. You know the rules," he said. They could use the circuit to build other products, but copying the panoramic telescope outright would be trouble. Fred had already picked up the roll and began to read. "Of course we know the rules," he said with a grin. "We've deciphered loads of Zonko's stuff, but we've never copied it," George added. "This is knowledge Scott worked out. There should be an exchange." "You decide," Fred told Scott. "No need," Scott said. "Bill's already shared a lot with me." "Bill is Bill. We are us," George muttered, rifling through an old desk. He pulled out a worn notebook. Fred glanced at it and said, "These are our notes on deciphering Zonko's products. There should be something here you'd find useful." George flipped through the pages and nodded. "Is this it?" "Yes." He handed the notebook over. "It might not be worth as much as what you did, but there are lots of clever ideas and little tricks inside." He held the book out until Scott had no choice but to take it. George breathed easier and with Fred began studying the rolled-up parchment. "Maybe you could make a magic camera," Eddie suggested. "The panoramic telescope wasn't designed for filming." Fred and George leaned in, interested. Eddie explained how Muggle cameras worked and even sketched diagrams. The three of them huddled, whispering ideas. Scott turned his attention back to editing. The footage from the 7 panoramic telescopes was long and came from different angles. For someone with little experience like him, the work was still massive. He wasn't aiming for a blockbuster, but he needed to integrate perspectives so the sequence of events would be clear. By curfew, he'd only finished a small portion. The twins planned to stay up in the workshop to study the circuit. Scott and Eddie went back to their dormitory together. After washing up, Scott sat propped against his bed, the magic mirror in his hands, continuing to edit. The mirror drew Roger and Milton's attention. Eddie, unable to contain his excitement, proudly explained what they'd done. Roger had lived in the Muggle world as a child, and Milton had spent time in London, so both quickly understood Eddie's description. "So you filmed Dumbledore leading Aurors into a big battle with a witch and Death Eaters?" Roger peered at the mirror screen. "Is that Dumbledore's power? I didn't imagine a wizard's charms could be like that." "Dumbledore isn't an ordinary wizard," Milton said, squeezing closer to watch the shifting images. Scott looked up. "Milton, choose a few pieces from your previous compositions that feel like Ravenclaw," he asked. "I plan to make a Ravenclaw promotional video after this." Milton hesitated, then smiled sadly. "I've lost my composing touch, or I would do something new for it." "Your old pieces are more than good enough," Roger said. "They'll work." Milton fetched a bulging folder from his bookshelf. "Maybe I need your opinions," he said, flipping through sheets of notation. "Pick some to consider." "No rush," Scott said. "We'll choose music once I have the footage." Eddie chimed in. "What should we film? What best showcases Ravenclaw?" Roger and Milton were keen to discuss it. Scott tried to speed up the edit, and around 2 in the morning he finally completed the first cut. The others hadn't slept either. Roger and Milton had watched parts of the footage as Scott worked and learned the details of what had happened in Little Hangleton. "As you suspected," Roger said quietly, "you probably won't be allowed to sell this footage." Scott shrugged. Except for Eddie, none of them were doing it for money. They were driven by curiosity. The next day after lunch, Scott took the magic mirror to Professor Flitwick's office. "Is something the matter, Scott?" Flitwick was grading essays. Teachers at Hogwarts had a hard job, often teaching multiple years and grading even during breaks. "I want to show you something." Scott placed the mirror on Flitwick's desk, tapped it with his wand, and an image sprang to life. Flitwick watched intently, but his voice sharpened when Medea, in green robes, appeared. "Could this be the Gaunt family home? How do you have footage like this?" he asked in surprise. Scott explained briefly where the images came from. Flitwick looked surprised. He had no idea Scott and the others had managed such a thing. The mirror switched to an interior view of the Gaunt house. Medea entered with several green-robed figures, set a golden cup on the floor, and a prepared ritual snapped into place, bathing the screen in dazzling blood-red light. "Hufflepuff's cup?" Flitwick said, staring at the golden cup in the image. "You know who often uses symbolic magical items to make Horcruxes," Scott said. "Indeed." Flitwick's mind went straight to Ravenclaw's diadem and the other Horcruxes. "He brings nothing but destruction," he said, indignant. The red light flickered, and the camera cut to Riddle Manor. 2 Death Eaters appeared, and Flitwick's eyes widened again when the screen showed the eerie, dimly seen baby. Poor lighting meant its face was never fully revealed. The camera switched back to the Gaunt house as Aurors arrived and the battle began. Dumbledore showed up in the footage too, and the mirror jumped between angles to display the chaos of Little Hangleton that night. The sequence froze as a Death Eater stole the Hufflepuff cup. Medea fled under Dumbledore's attack, and Aurors arrested the defeated Death Eater and the green-robed accomplices. "I never thought Dumbledore's magic had progressed to that level," Flitwick said, focusing on the charms. He took a few calming sips of tea. "Scott, is your plan to sell this video?" Scott told the truth. "It could be big, given Medea's interview. Everyone's curious about that night." Flitwick nodded. "Of course people are curious, but I advise you not to sell it, and don't let many people know what you did." "Why?" Scott asked. Flitwick sighed. "If this video spreads, you will be feared. You exposed a dark secret, something even Slytherin and Dumbledore didn't see. People will worry you'll expose their privacy. You'd become like those Muggle reporters who sneak photos of celebrities. Very unpopular." Scott was taken aback. He hadn't considered that angle, but Flitwick's words made sense. Once the footage was out, anyone with bad intent could trace it back to the seller. Scott was trying to keep out of Medea's notice. He had no desire to thrust himself into the spotlight. He told Flitwick of the plan to make a Ravenclaw promotional video instead. Flitwick supported the idea enthusiastically. "Good," he said. "If you need help, come to me." Flitwick held the mirror and motioned Scott to follow him. They walked through winding corridors and to a hidden door. He knocked. Dumbledore's voice invited them in. The headmaster sat behind his desk and smiled. "Good afternoon, Phileas and Scott." Scott set the mirror on Dumbledore's desk and replayed the edited video. Dumbledore watched with an amused smile. He wasn't as surprised as Flitwick, but watched attentively. "I never thought I'd see that battle like this. Maybe I'm not too old yet," he remarked. Then he looked up at Scott. "Thank you. I noticed details I'd missed." Dumbledore deftly learned to use the mirror, sliding a long finger across its surface to rewind and freeze the scene before the two Death Eaters left Riddle Manor. "You might not know this," he said, pointing to the barely visible house. "This is Riddle Manor, the home of Lord Voldemort's father, Tom Riddle." "Oh," Flitwick blurted. "You know whose father? I thought he was a Muggle, according to Slytherin." "He was," Dumbledore said softly. "The families were close enough that Merope Gaunt fell in love with Tom Riddle and, using a love potion, got him to elope with her." Flitwick frowned at the idea of a love potion being used to secure affection. Dumbledore pointed to the small figure held by a Death Eater, Sprott. "I suspect that is Lord Voldemort," he said. "He's not a mere remnant soul anymore, but he's still very weak. Otherwise, he wouldn't hide so carefully." Dumbledore's assessment made sense. Harry had once told him about dreams that hinted at this. "His body, is it incomplete?" Flitwick asked. "It seems his current power isn't enough for a full revival." "He's searching for opportunities," Dumbledore said. "And that golden cup, Hufflepuff's cup, is that a Horcrux? Will he gain power by reclaiming it?" Flitwick asked. Dumbledore shook his head. "I suspect that cup is a fake. Slytherin would not give Voldemort such an advantage." Dumbledore replayed a few small details again before returning the mirror to Scott. "A very interesting alchemical product," he said. "To achieve this without Hogwarts even offering alchemy classes is remarkable." "Thank you," Scott said quietly. He knew his creation was really an application of runic circuits rather than true alchemy. Given his frequent visits to the Room of Requirement and the Ravenclaw portrait's tutoring, he doubted the headmaster was entirely unaware of his activities. "Tell me, how did you get these images?" Dumbledore asked. Scott glanced at the nearby portraits and explained his method. Dumbledore's face lit with understanding. "Panoramic telescope? I know that little toy. Everyone uses it as a telescope. Only you found another use." Scott smiled, a little shy. Flitwick reiterated his advice to keep the matter secret so the students wouldn't get into trouble. Dumbledore had no objection and appeared to have other business with Flitwick, so he let Scott leave alone. Outside, on the 8th floor staircase, Scott found Fred, George, and Eddie waiting. "How was it? What did Flitwick say?" Eddie asked. "Professor Flitwick advised us to keep this matter secret," Scott whispered, relaying the warning. Eddie nodded. so we really should keep it quiet. Fred and George pretended to agree, but Scott noticed they were dozing against the wall. You two didn't sleep last night? He asked quietly. Eddie shrugged. Obviously. George peeled his eyes open and shook his head to wake up. Professor Flitwick's right, he said. We can't become like Rita Skeeter. We didn't sleep last night. That runic circuit study. Fred mumbled, and the two started talking over each other. You two should skip class and get some sleep, Scott said with a smile. What class do you have this afternoon? Fred and George looked blank, then remembered. Potions. Scott looked at them with sympathy. In their state, they were likely to blow up their cauldrons. Eddie laughed. Wait till you see points being taken off, he said. But it doesn't matter. Gryffindor doesn't have many house points left to lose anyway. After the conversation in the headmaster's office, Scott decided to throw himself fully into producing Ravenclaw's promotional video. The school year had been long, full of hard study and emotionally draining events, so this project was a welcome bit of fun, a way to ease his usual tension. After dinner, he, Eddie, and the Weasley twins went back to the little studio in the secret passage. Eddie kept staring at Fred and George in amazement until he couldn't hold back. You actually survived potions class this afternoon? He asked. Fred's face went triumphant. We've got a lot of experience with that sort of thing. George stuck his chin out. Even Snape couldn't touch us. Eddie grinned. You didn't fall asleep? You didn't blow up a cauldron? Of course not. We didn't skip either, Fred said, clearly enjoying the moment. The twins exchanged a conspiratorial look and refused to elaborate until Scott leaned in. Is it an energy potion or a time turner? They shrugged in unison. Okay, it's a time turner, George admitted. Ever since we saw Hermione and Harry use one to save Buckbeak, we've wanted to try it. We pinched Percy's, Fred added with a grin. Went back to the morning and took a long nap. You can do that? Eddie sounded half annoyed, half impressed. If I'd known, I'd have doubled down on classes so I could play with one. The twins gave him a look. Not everyone can take everything at once like Percy. Even Hermione has trouble. Right, Eddie shrugged. Just saying. They laughed and chatted for a while. Fred and George returned to studying the magic circuit they'd deciphered from the panoramic telescope. Eddie busied himself with a promotional brochure, and Scott turned his attention to a practical problem: how to capture sound for the video. He asked the twins, what material's best for carrying sound? Can't your magic mirror do it? Fred asked. I remember it used flobberworm blood to etch the circuit. Scott shook his head. I need something better, something for recording sound for the video. It's fine as is, George said. You could mix in crystal powder. Good idea, Scott agreed. Crystal conducted magic well and was a common alchemical enhancer. He took a small piece of brass from his pouch and, with a flick of his wand, transformed it into a tiny eagle the size of a thumb. The transfiguration left delicate grooves across its body, perfect for a magic circuit. He mixed flobberworm blood with crushed crystal powder and a little mercury. With a wand movement, the liquid spun into fine filaments that flew up and embedded into the grooves. A final tap of his wand set the eagle back into brooch form. Done? Eddie peered at the little brooch. Try it. Scott held it, and the eagle opened its beak. Speaking in Eddie's voice, Done? Try it? Scott grinned. He drew a silvery thread from the brooch, flicked it into the magic mirror, and traced the mirror's surface. The voice imported cleanly. Playback worked. We need lion brooches, Fred said immediately. Eddie wasn't slow to claim one of the eagles. Scott made another eagle and 2 lion brooches, giving them out. We should find cheaper materials if we want to sell simple players, he said, pointing to the mirror. This one's not cheap. Most Hogwarts students couldn't afford it. Eddie nodded. Look at the parts. Flobberworm and its blood, boggart powder, expensive stuff. Can't we just use mercury? George asked. It's the cheapest and works for engraving circuits, just not as well. Let's try, Scott said. He wrote runes on a smaller mirror with a mercury-dipped quill, activated the circuit, and imported a test clip. All 4 frowned. Too blurry, Fred said. The picture and sound were both fuzzy. Try adding crystal powder, Eddie suggested. Scott did. The blend of mercury and crystal produced a much better image. Not quite the original mirror's clarity, but usable. Crystal's not cheap either, George muttered. On a large scale, it'll add up. Eddie laughed. I'll sort the crystal. We only need powder. I can get it for free. They all looked at him. Eddie explained, my dad has a crystal jewelry workshop. The fragments and dust from cutting are perfect. Then that's settled. Fred clapped Eddie on the shoulder. Scott smiled. Mr. Carmichael runs a big operation then. Just a jewelry business, Eddie demurred. With sound capture solved, Scott and Eddie started production. You two start, Scott told the twins. We'll make Gryffindor's promo later. We'll start after we invent a magical camera that records both sight and sound, the twins said confidently. Scott wasn't bothered. Using the panoramic telescope with the brooches would do the job. Over the next week, the two of them, often with Roger, Milton, and the twins tagging along, appeared across Hogwarts with panoramic telescopes, the Great Hall, the library, Ravenclaw Tower, the common room, the Quidditch pitch, classrooms. Whenever anyone asked, they just smiled and didn't explain. A week of filming and a week of editing later, they set the premiere for Saturday evening. Scott hung a full-length mirror horizontally on the common room wall and began playing a continuous reel of clips, daily life of Ravenclaw, unedited footage that drew a crowd for most of the day. Students craned their necks, laughing and pointing. Dylan, is that you? Kayla, right there. Oh no, there's ink on my face. I remember that essay. Is this from the Quidditch match? Why is there a shot of me falling off my broom? By evening, the common room was buzzing. Scott, Roger, and Milton sat on a sofa while Eddie stood by the mirror, beaming. A few bold lines of text glided across the mirror and someone read them aloud. Capturing images and sound, documenting Ravenclaw, the first promotional video of Ravenclaw at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, exceptional wisdom. Producers, Scott Trollope, Eddie Carmichael, Roger Davies. Music, Milton Graves. Consultant, Phileas Flitwick. Assisted by Ravenclaw faculty and students. Produced by Ravenclaw. Premiere, March 14th, 1994, Saturday, 8 p.m. Stay tuned. What is this? Eddie, you little rascal, tell us. Eddie clapped his hands and took up his role. Fellow students, this is a promotional video we made to promote our house, to show the ideals and spirit that Ravenclaw has carried since its founding. Scott, sitting back on the sofa, laughed. See? Leaving this to Eddie was the right call. Scott! Luna slid into the seat opposite him and peered at the mirror. Is this your work? That's right, he said. It's been fun. Luna laughed again at some of the clips. Jacob, who had come up, grinned. You trying to show off? If nothing weird happens, this year's House Cup is ours. Didn't think about the cup, Scott said, just for fun. Fun it is, Luna agreed, still chuckling at the classmates' antics. Eddie finished his spiel with a flourish. For tonight's premiere at 8, Professor Flitwick will be joining us in the common room. The students cheered and then dispersed to get comfortable. After breakfast the next day, Scott stopped by the room of requirement and played the finished video for the portrait of Helena Ravenclaw. He'd asked the house founder's portrait to appear in it. She had obliged with interest. When the music wound down and the footage ended, Helena smiled. How interesting, she said. It makes one proud and a little moved. Don't you think, Mother? Ravenclaw's portrait nodded with contained pleasure. Very good. Her gaze lingered on Scott with appreciation. I did not expect this, she murmured, but such lively ideas have power to change the lives of witches and wizards. Scott deflected the praise. It's just borrowing a form of entertainment the Muggles already use. I've simply used magic to do what they've done. Ravenclaw raised an eyebrow. No wonder you always said the Muggles developed quickly, she sighed. In my day, Muggles seemed backward, like sheep herded by the church, leaves far inferior to ours. Scott corrected gently. They hadn't yet found ways to understand and change the world. Now they have, in some ways more than we do. Helena listened, intrigued, and asked Scott to tell her about modern Muggle history. Outstanding wisdom is humanity's greatest treasure, she quoted, and then added, once that was only about wizards, but now it seems wisdom matters for all people. She paused, remembering something. Is this why Medea put forward those ideas? Scott nodded. He'd told Helena about Medea's banner and her call for acceleration. He'd also told her of Medea's travels in the Muggle world and how much it had shocked the witch. Medea's words have truth to them, Scott said. That's why she draws people. Helena asked, more to the point, why Scott hadn't joined Medea. He answered cleanly, Correct people will say correct things, and incorrect people can say correct things too, sometimes to achieve wrong goals. Ravenclaw smiled. It is wise to be cautious. She told them about Salazar Slytherin's departure from Hogwarts, how he'd claimed to leave to teach in secret, how Godric and Helga believed him, but she had always suspected a hidden purpose. Scott asked quietly if she thought Medea might be connected to Slytherin. Ravenclaw's reply was careful but telling. When Medea was younger, she did not seem the sort to change the whole magical world. Perhaps she has grown since. I do not trust such sudden, sweeping ambitions. Her caution confirmed what Scott already felt. Medea's rhetoric sounded plausible, but Scott had never entirely trusted her. Her early choices, using binding vows to take others' talents, sacrificing lives, even the rumor of killing her husband, sat uneasily with her later proclamations. Hearing Ravenclaw speak of Salazar made Scott respect the portrait's instinctive vigilance all the more. Later that afternoon, at dinner, Ravenclaw students buzzed with excitement about the premiere. Other houses watched them with baffled amusement. The Ravenclaws hadn't told anyone else what they were up to. They want to show it first, Eddie said when Scott wondered why the secrecy. If it's impressive, they'll be proud to tell the others. By evening, the common room was packed. Half an hour before 8, Professor Flitwick arrived, and his presence quieted the students. He walked to a sofa reserved for him and sat down. People crowded around, brimming with questions and eager to start. "Start it, Scott," came a shout. "Yeah, it's past 8 for some of us. Just show it." "Eddie, you do it," they all urged at once. Scott didn't mind. The time had only been set so people wouldn't miss it. But as he rose, Milton put a hand on his arm. "Wait," Milton said quietly. "We set a time. Let's stick to it." He liked ritual and meant it. Scott sat back down, and the demand in the room grew louder. Eddie hurried forward with placating words, while Flitwick watched the scene with an amused smile, neither agreeing nor scolding. 354. Watch, ask, promote. In the Ravenclaw common room, as everyone waited with mild impatience, 8 p.m. finally arrived. Scott stood and waved his wand. The looping images on the large mirror hanger hanging on the wall gradually faded, and the surface went completely black. The room fell quiet, and all eyes fixed on the glass. Soft music began to play, and the Ravenclaw crest slowly emerged from the dark, growing clearer and clearer. A familiar song started to play as the view shifted. If you're clever, you might belong to wise Ravenclaw, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. The first image in the frame was a battered wizard's hat, an image not often seen, but instantly recognizable. It was the Sorting Hat, singing a verse about Ravenclaw from the Sorting Hat song. Scott had filmed the sequence in the headmaster's office. Embarrassingly, he had gone there himself, and Dumbledore had not objected. "How can it beat the sorting ceremony?" someone murmured. "I think so too," Milton said. Scott smiled and gave a thumbs up to Milton, who sat beside him. There was a reason the Sorting Hat sequence sounded especially good. Milton had, in a burst of inspiration, composed music for the Sorting Hat verse the year they enrolled. After that short segment, the Sorting Hat image faded, and a girl appeared in the mirror. "Welcome to Ravenclaw." Penelope Clearwater, a 7th-year prefect, stood beneath Ravenclaw Tower in her formal uniform, her smooth brown hair glinting in the sun. She smiled as if welcoming new students. The camera pulled away from her as though circling upward like an eagle, sweeping along the tower. At Scott's invitation, Penelope provided narration. "Our house animal is an eagle, soaring to unreachable peaks." An eagle cry echoed. A majestic eagle filled the screen, wings spread as it circled the tower. "Our house colors are sky blue and bronze." The eagle landed and gripped the flagpole with its talons. A sky blue and bronze flag fluttered. "Our common room is located at the top of Ravenclaw Tower, hidden behind a door with a magical knocker. From the arched windows of the circular common room, you can see the entire Hogwarts grounds. The Great Lake, the Forbidden Forest, the Quidditch pitch, and the greenhouses, a view other houses are not as fortunate to enjoy. Without intending to boast, this is where the cleverest witches and wizards live. Like the founder, Rowena Ravenclaw, who prized learning above all." As Penelope spoke, the mirror showed matching images at precisely the right moments. "Oh, that's Ravenclaw's most traditional welcome," Professor Flitwick said with a small sigh from where he sat. When we were new, the prefects used to give that long set speech to introduce the house. Later, people felt it lacked novelty, so it was abandoned. The footage continued, explaining Ravenclaw's unique entrance to the common room, the riddle posed by the eagle knocker. The camera showed students gathered around the knocker, debating answers. The narration touched on Ravenclaw's eccentricity and self-acceptance, then introduced Professor Flitwick as the house's dean. The screen cut to many of the house's eccentricities, Luna in her specter specs holding an upside-down magazine and reading intently. Luna, sitting opposite Scott, began to laugh silently, eyes wide. Professor Flitwick flushed slightly when the bit about him came up. "Oh, was that added? It wasn't there before. I wasn't the dean back then, of course." "You're a beloved dean," several students chorused. "We all like you very much." Flitwick listened to the outpouring with a broad smile and a deeper blush. The narration moved on to Ravenclaw's proud history and its inventors and innovators. Scott had gone through the trouble of including portraits and photos of every famous Ravenclaw mentioned, images clipped from the wizard cards that came with Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans, with Fred and George's help. "No wonder they stopped using the full speech," Roger said softly. "It's interesting, but too long without visuals and music." Scott nodded. "Now we encourage new students to explore the house's history themselves. Direct indoctrination isn't as effective as letting them discover it." If he hadn't needed to make a promotional video, he wouldn't have revived the long speech, which now only sits in a book in the house library. The camera returned to Penelope beneath the tower. "Congratulations on becoming members of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry's cleverest, most agile, and most interesting house, Ravenclaw." Her part ended. Many students murmured, "Our prefects weren't this friendly when we joined," remembering how Scott and Kayla had intimidated the first years during their own welcome. The screen went black again. The music turned mysterious. "Wit beyond measure is man's greatest treasure." A gentle, steady female voice intoned the Ravenclaw motto, and the words appeared on the dark glass. The black faded, and a portrait on a wall came into view. The witch in the painting had long, curly black hair, wore an exquisite eagle-shaped jeweled diadem, her eyes bright with wisdom and a kind smile on her lips. She sat in a high-backed chair carved with bronze eagle wings, regal and beautiful. Gasps rippled through the common room. "Ravenclaw? Is that a portrait of Ravenclaw?" Almost everyone glanced at the bronze Ravenclaw statue by the library for comparison and confirmed their guess. "It's really her. Why have we never seen it? Scott, where did you find it? Did you paint it from the statue?" The students were practically vibrating with excitement. Professor Flitwick cleared his throat. "Ahem, let's finish watching first," he urged. The room reluctantly settled, but all eyes were on Scott and Eddie, the video's producers. The portrait moved, drawing everyone's attention. Ravenclaw's gaze softened, and she smiled. "I hope to recruit students whose intelligence is superior." At once, many students puffed out their chests, as if to proclaim, "That's me!" The portrait vanished after a few seconds, prompting a chorus of disappointed sighs. "Seeking knowledge." Words flashed on the screen, and the music resumed, soothing and beautiful. Scenes of quiet reading in the library, lively experiments and discussions in the common room, attentive listening in classrooms, Ravenclaws shown in every corner of the castle. The camera switched quickly, vividly capturing the house's pursuit of knowledge. "I'm on camera. That's me." Recovered from the shock of seeing the portrait, students began hunting the footage eagerly. Each time the view cut to a familiar face, that person proudly claimed the shot. "Everyone's happy," Milton murmured to Scott. Scott nodded. "Because everyone feels included." More words appeared. The music swelled as more instruments joined until it stopped abruptly. Exploration, immersion, precision, freedom. Each word accompanied a flurry of images illustrating the traits. Nearly everyone in Ravenclaw appeared, including Helena, the house ghost, who floated quietly in a corner of the common room, smiling slightly as she watched. As the music softened, the video neared its end, and Scott's personal touches came on. Scott stood on a high stone bridge and spoke to the camera. "Ravenclaws focus on what interests them. We tend to stay aloof from other matters." The shot cut to Eddie in his dormitory, but only we understand what we pursue. At the Quidditch pitch, Roger, still in his Quidditch robes, said our house name means Raven's Claw. We are ravenous for knowledge, but often scornful of power and fame. In the classical music club, Milton cradled his cello. Our representative element is wind. Among the four elements, wind represents change, reason, abstraction, wit, sociability, and language, but also disputes, detachment, lack of foundation, and impetuosity. Professor Flitwick smiled from his office desk. We advocate for extraordinary wisdom. Luna sat on a windowsill with her knees hugged to her chest and turned her head dreamily. Extraordinary wisdom. At the Black Lake Pier, Jacob murmured, extraordinary wisdom. In the corridor, Kayla and Dylan said together, extraordinary wisdom. Extraordinary wisdom, said Eva. Extraordinary wisdom, said Ethan. Extraordinary wisdom, said Cho. Extraordinary wisdom, said Andre Chambers. One after another, the students appeared, repeating the phrase that served as the video's title. The Ravenclaw portrait returned for a final word as the music fell silent. Wisdom is merely a prerequisite. I want my Ravenclaws to perch like eagles atop the highest towers and the broadest skies. You need not join the struggles on the ground, but your keen sight can see everything from above. Not participating is only because you choose not to. Let no one sway your stance or your actions. I hope you become free wizards. At the very least, let your minds be free. The screen dimmed to black. New music began. Half of the mirror filled with the Ravenclaw banner, while the other half scrolled credits listing the production team. Cheers rose through the common room. Everyone clapped. Looks like you pulled it off, Roger whooped, clapping Scott on the shoulder so hard he nearly stumbled. Well done. I'm seeing the finished product for the first time too, and it's fantastic. Milton applauded loudly. Eddie, standing at the front, beamed with obvious pride, chin up and grin wide. Jacob, surprised, said to Scott, so you were filming when you got me to say that line? I had no idea what I was doing at the time, Luna blinked, then smiled. But it was fun. She had been laughing all evening, silent laughter at the quiet parts, now open laughter. Scott didn't try to figure out what amused her. More and more people gathered around the sofa where he sat. Scott, Penelope stepped forward, smiling. Although I had some idea of what you were up to, I didn't expect you to do it so well. Thanks, Scott said quickly. He knew the video wasn't a masterpiece, his technical skill was limited, but his experience from another life helped make the concept work, and the novelty of the format in the wizarding world had won everyone's favor. Penelope's smile turned intent. We still have questions. You can ask Eddie, Scott deflected. He and I made it together. He's more talkative than I am and will answer you. Ethan snorted. Eddie, everyone knows that kid exaggerates. He's not known for truthfulness. Who said that? My chief virtue is honesty. Don't sully my good name, Ethan. Eddie protested from the edge of the circle. Besides, I'm just Scott's assistant. Let him answer. Don't fob us off, Penelope said. You know what I want to ask. Ethan leaned in and patted Scott's shoulder. You sneaky kid, spill it. That portrait that can speak. Where is it exactly? Scott glanced around. Where's Professor Flitwick? He asked, hoping to hand the questions off. A voice from the periphery called, Professor Flitwick already left. Silence. Scott's plan to dump the questions on Flitwick had failed. Don't change the subject. Tell us, Penelope demanded. I think the portrait is hung in our common room, someone guessed. Did you film it in the headmaster's office? Another asked. No way. There isn't a Ravenclaw portrait there, came a reply. All the portraits there are of recent headmasters. How do you know there's not one? Scott assumed an air of certainty. I filmed it in the headmaster's office. You're lying, Penelope retorted. I've been to the headmaster's office. There's no Ravenclaw portrait. Yeah, me too, others chimed in. How do you know there isn't a hidden room? Scott demanded loftily. His confidence made many of them pause. Some were inclined to believe him. Scott internally exhaled with relief as the crowd thinned. Luna across from him kept laughing. He made a discreet shushing gesture, and she winked back, deciding not to betray him. Eddie suddenly bounded onto the table and waved for attention. Ravenclaw students, listen up. What do you want now, kid? Penelope looked skeptical. No one will believe your tall tales. I'm not talking nonsense, Eddie said, and it's not about what you think. Then get down and tell us, Penelope said. No, I'm asking you all a question. Eddie raised his voice. What did you think of the promotional video? Ethan laughed. Do you want compliments? You said you're just Scott's assistant. No, Eddie waved energetically. I'm asking, don't you want to keep a copy of such a great, fun promotional video? How? Steal the big mirror back to the dorms? Someone joked. Of course not. Eddie reached into his pocket and produced a small mirror about the size of 2 palms. It's this. What is that? Is it the same as that big mirror? Almost, Scott said. This is a budget alternative to a magic mirror, a magic crystal player. You can use it to watch the promotional video we just saw. He tapped the device in Eddie's hand. Music chimed, and the video began playing on the tiny crystal screen. Heads turned. Magic Crystal Player, with the first Ravenclaw promotional video built in. Watch it again and again. If you want one, place your order with me. Eddie grinned and announced. How much? Someone immediately asked. Eddie held up one finger. 1 galleon? Too expensive, he teased. I can't afford it, someone groaned. Eddie's grin widened. 10 sickles each. 10 sickles? Can you really sell that? Is that what you have in your hand? Crystal isn't cheap, Ethan scoffed. It uses cheap crystal powder, Eddie said. Besides, we're not doing this to get rich, we're promoting our house. Then why charge at all? Ethan mocked. To cover costs. Do you expect Scott and me to pay for this ourselves? Eddie protested. Those who knew Eddie rolled their eyes. Scott isn't in it for money, but Eddie definitely is. He's always looking for a way to make a profit. He probably got the rights to sell it because he's friends with Scott. What player? This is probably a cheap knockoff of Scott's mirror. Eddie glared at Scott and waved the player toward the crowd. Look, it's almost as clear as the big mirror on the wall. 10 sickles. You aren't fooling yourselves. He went on enthusiastically, extolling the tiny device, and for a while, a surprising number of students actually began scribbling their names on a pre-order list. 355. Occupation, limelight, collapse. That night in the dormitory, Scott and his roommates lay on their beds, chatting. A total of 52 people pre-ordered the Magic Crystal Player tonight, Eddie said, grinning. If we show the promotional video in the Great Hall, maybe more will be interested. Roger raised an eyebrow. Do you think people from other houses will buy something made by Ravenclaw? Eddie was confident. A player that can play moving pictures. How could they resist? This kind of thing's never appeared in the wizarding world before. He sat up and turned to Scott. Scott, let's move that big mirror to the Great Hall tomorrow. Whatever you want, Scott said. That mirror only plays back what it records. It can't be edited. Nothing bad can happen. I'm going to do more than just sell the video, Eddie said. I want to get everyone used to this new form of entertainment. Roger asked, what exactly do you want to do? Eddie's eyes lit up. This could be a long-term moneymaker. If we keep producing interesting content, we can keep making money. That's the plan for now. You're starting a wizard entertainment company? Scott asked. I was thinking about it, Eddie said, more excited. With your talent and creativity, we could even open cinemas in the wizarding world someday. If we figure out how to connect screens, maybe a television station. Roger chuckled. If you run Wizard TV, you could control public opinion. That'd be something, Milton said approvingly. Scott gave a half smile. Go for it. I'll support you. Aren't you coming with me? Eddie asked, surprised. Scott wasn't interested in the business side. Making the promotional video was just for fun, he told Eddie, but I'll give you technical support. Consider it an investment, Eddie muttered and turned to Milton and Roger. What about you two? Milton shook his head. Sorry, Eddie, I've already decided what I want to do after school. Remember what I said last Halloween? Oh, right, Eddie sighed. You're heading to the Muggle world to pursue music. Exactly, Milton said, firm. Eddie didn't press him. Roger said, it's too early to decide now. Let's see after graduation. Fine, Eddie clicked his tongue. By the way, you don't actually think you can become a professional Quidditch player, do you? Roger bristled. Why not? Eddie snorted. Your skills don't have much room to improve. You're a bit short compared to real professionals. Roger had no retort. I haven't decided yet. Milton looked at Scott. Are Eddie and I the only ones with plans? Scott, what about you? Scott stretched. This a careers talk? My profession is wizard. Eddie gave a snorty laugh. That joke's not funny. I mean, I want to keep studying magic, Scott clarified. Roger suggested maybe you could join the Department of Mysteries at the Ministry. No, I don't want to be an unspeakable, Scott yawned. After graduation, I'll travel, see how magic's done in other places. The others were quiet for a moment. Eddie warned, That's dangerous. You'll run into dangerous people everywhere you go. Scott chuckled. I think I'm one of the dangerous people. Roger sounded wistful. That would be amazing, but I probably couldn't do it. Milton was serious. Scott, you have the strongest magical talent among us. Maybe you could become a powerful wizard like Dumbledore. Who knows? Scott sounded casual, but his eyes were resolute. I'll try. The next morning, Scott found Eddie's bed empty. Morning, Roger said, yawning. Noting Scott's glance toward the empty bed, he added, He must have already moved that big mirror to the Great Hall. Scott smiled helplessly. Eddie only gets this energetic when there's money involved. At breakfast in the Great Hall, they found Eddie fussing with the big mirror at the front, mounted on a wooden stand he'd built. It was fine in the Ravenclaw common room, Scott murmured to Roger and Milton, but in front of the whole school, this feels embarrassing. Same, Milton admitted. A little. Roger agreed. Most Ravenclaws, though, were proud rather than embarrassed. Several were helping Eddie, and many were showing off to friends from other houses. When Eddie saw his 3 roommates, he waved happily. Scott, Milton, and Roger ignored him and sat down at the Ravenclaw table. Fred and George Weasley made a show of themselves behind Scott, loudly commenting, Oh, George, look, the Ravenclaw boys are going to be so proud. Don't worry, Fred, George replied. We won't let them keep that pride for long. Ron, curious, asked Harry, What are they doing? Is that mirror any good? Just then Eddie finished setting up. Music started and images appeared on the mirror. Oh, images are appearing, just like a TV, Harry exclaimed. Scott turned. Do you 3 need to stand behind me and talk the whole breakfast? Of course, the twins chorused. We'll stand right here. Fred and George made faces at him. The preview playing in the mirror drew the whole hall's attention. Harry read the title aloud, Ravenclaw Promotional Video, Outstanding Wisdom, produced by Scott Trollope. He looked at Scott. Scott, did you invent wizard television? How did you do it? Hermione squeezed next to Harry, eyes burning. What magic? A panoramic telescope, Scott said. Ron knows what that is, right? Hermione and Harry stared at Ron. I know what a panoramic telescope is, Ron said, puzzled. But what does the mirror have to do with it? It's used to film images with the panoramic telescope. Then put the images in the mirror, Fred and George said triumphantly. Of course, they're idiots, right? Normal, he didn't think of it, Fred added for emphasis. I could think of it. How does an ordinary mirror do that? The twins sniggered and ran back to their table, giggling. Harry and Hermione kept peppering Ron with questions about panoramic telescopes. A sumptuous breakfast appeared on the tables and the full promotional video began. Conversation vanished as everyone watched the moving images in the mirror. Even the Ravenclaws sat upright, proud smiles on their faces. Scott poured himself a glass of milk, and the sound made several Ravenclaws shoot him annoyed looks. He set the jug down and kept watching. When the video showed a portrait of the Ravenclaw founder, a gasp rippled through the hall. Voices murmured, Impossible. Must be fake. Hogwarts doesn't have portraits of the founders. Others believed, maybe it's true, the diadem's been found. Maybe the portrait's in the Ravenclaw common room and they've been hiding it from outsiders. Scott glanced at his housemates. The Ravenclaws all wore reserved, knowing smiles, neither offended nor pleased by the speculation. As the video ended, the portrait addressed the Ravenclaws with a few gentle words. Ravenclaws applauded politely, winking at Scott. To avoid standing out, he joined their applause, earning envious looks from other students. Ravenclaw was enjoying a rare moment in the spotlight. As producer, Scott drew curious stares and questions, so he finished breakfast early and slipped away. He used his magic sense to avoid being stopped and climbed to the 8th floor, entering Helena Ravenclaw's study. Good morning, Scott. The painted maiden in the study greeted him more enthusiastically than usual. How was it? She asked, moving to a painting near the door with impatient curiosity. Did everyone like the promotional video? The Ravenclaws loved it. I don't know about the others, Scott said. You could have been in the common room last night. Helena sat in her painted chair, chin on hand, demure. I was only asking. I didn't want to join the excitement. Since the ghost Helena entered the painting, the maiden Helena could now leave the study and move through the castle's paintings, though she rarely did and never let anyone know. Scott didn't know why, and she didn't say. He answered the question she meant to ask. When the Ravenclaw portrait appeared, everyone asked where it was. "Did you tell them?" she asked eagerly. "I told them it's hidden in the headmaster's office," Scott replied, smiling. "This study is secret, after all." "Then let them search the headmaster's office," Helena said, delighted. They chatted a while longer before Scott went into the inner room to study. That afternoon, he left the room of requirement and was promptly intercepted by Fred, George, and Eddie. "There you are, appearing out of thin air," Fred crowed, brandishing the Marauder's map. George peered with curiosity. "Is there a hidden chamber of secrets in there?" They both grabbed Scott's shoulders theatrically. "We've shared so many secrets with you," they accused in mock outrage. "And you never told us you'd found a new chamber of secrets." They released him and clutched each other as if wounded. Scott twitched a smile and turned to Eddie. "The pre-orders for the player went up again," Eddie said, shaking his small notebook. "You need to make them faster." "I need a better way," Scott said. "Making them by hand is tedious." Fred began a loud, fake sob. "Look at him, too disdainful to care." "We've been misjudged," George wailed, clinging to Fred. "He doesn't consider us true friends anymore." Scott frowned at the melodrama. Eddie nodded in agreement. The twins, overhearing, charged down the corridor toward the room of requirement, calling, "We'll find it ourselves." They tapped and rapped at the wall with their wands. "Go on, look," Scott said, amusement in his voice. "I bet you won't find it." They redoubled their efforts, tapping, feeling along the tapestry, mumbling incantations. After a bit, Eddie joined them. "Nothing." Fred declared, "This place needs a special password," and glared at Scott. Scott spread his hands. "Quite a few people know about this Chamber of Secrets," he admitted. "Hurry up," he explained. "It's called the Room of Requirement, or the Come and Go Room. Think of the kind of room you need, then walk back and forth 3 times in this corridor." "Let me try," Fred said and strode back and forth. A door appeared in the wall. "It's real," George said, and pushed it open. They all peered in, mouths forming small O's. They squeezed through. Scott went to look and was speechless. Inside was a super luxurious restroom Dumbledore had once mentioned. "Close the door," Fred yelled. "I really need to pee." Scott stepped out and closed the door. 2 seconds later, the door vanished, leaving only stone wall. Then, after a while, the door reappeared, and the twins and Eddie emerged, babbling about the gold-plated chamber pot. "Try the storage room," Scott suggested with a smile. "You'll find treasure." They pushed the door again, and another unbelievable sight greeted them. Piles of junk, towering to the ceiling. "We're rich," Eddie cried and darted in, the twins at his heels. Scott followed and shut the door behind them. The 3 disappeared into the avalanche of stuff like mice in a grain bin. "Is this a fang flapper?" "Too bad it's broken," Fred muttered. "If we'd found this sooner, we could have saved a fortune on textbooks." "Look, a troll specimen," George said. The trio crowded under a grotesque troll display, pinching their noses at the smell. Scott moved carefully through the mountains of junk, not touching anything. He used his magic sense to find the others. They gathered around a quintuped skeleton in a corner, those legendary human-loving monsters. "Is that a quintuped?" Fred asked, awed. "Granddad told us stories about them." George lowered his voice. "The McClary wizards supposedly transfigured the entire Macboon family into quintupeds, then they got eaten. That legend's probably a bit much," Eddie said. "Maybe people just thought the feet looked human." "Wizards turning people into beasts isn't unheard of," Fred shrugged. I then noticed something. "Oh, there's a wand." He plunged his hand into a nearby heap and pulled out a long wand, waving it triumphantly. Scott's eyes narrowed. Removing that wand was like pulling a keystone from a precarious stack. The towering pile of junk began to sway. "Pertigo!" Scott cried, erecting an invisible shield around Fred just in time. "Run!" George dragged Fred, and they charged for the door. Behind them came the thunder of collapsing junk. Like dominoes, one tumbling pile destabilized another. Debris surged toward them in a wall. "No time!" Eddie screamed. Scott realized they couldn't get to the door in time. He stopped, pointed his wand at a few old-school desks, and with a sharp Wingardium Leviosa, levitated them into a rough barricade between his friends and the oncoming tide of junk. Scott's wand twitched, and a warm transfiguration glow swept over several old desks. With a shriek like an eagle's cry, the 4 desks sprang to life as giant birds. Each swooped in, clamped huge talons around one of the 4 students, flung them into the air, and caught them on their backs, carrying them up toward the ceiling just before the wave of falling debris could crush them. Ah! Ah! Eddie and the Weasley twins screamed. The room of requirements storage had an almost endless vertical space, and the accumulated junk that Hogwarts staff and students had discarded over centuries was enormous. The collapsing piles sounded like an avalanche, a continuous thunder of tumbling rubbish. Scott clung to the feathers of the eagle beneath him, squinting down at the chaos of shifting debris. What in the world was going on? He didn't know whether to call Fred lucky or unlucky. Lucky that he had drawn a wand from the pile at all. Unlucky that it had apparently set off the whole room. Nothing like this had happened in the original work. The other 3 gradually stopped screaming and stared. Fred, the cause of it all, lay laughing across his eagle's back, waving the long wand like a baton. "This is brilliant," he crowed. "This is all your fault, Fred," George hollered. "We almost got buried in a pile of trash." Fred didn't care. "It must be an extraordinary wand," he shouted, still grinning. "Then use it properly," George snapped. Fred waved the long wand and called, "Accio!" A thin blue stream of light leapt from the wand tip and struck the debris below. "Stop it, you idiot!" George roared. Eddie shouted the same. The next second, a swirling hurricane rose from where the charm hit, swelling and sweeping lighter rubbish up into its funnel. The 4 giant eagles twisted nimbly to avoid it. The group separated instantly. Scott frowned as books and scraps lanced toward the ceiling. He glanced at Fred. Pressing his wand to his throat, he cast Sonorous. "George," Scott amplified, his voice booming through the cavernous space. "Is Fred all right?" From the other side, Fred's distant voice shouted, "Accio!" Another hurricane formed. "No, he's not all right." George's amplified reply was suddenly anxious. "That wand is definitely strange." Fred's laughter came through again. "Ha ha! Accio! Oh my God!" Eddie began to scream. "He's still doing it. Do something!" Scott had not expected a simple detour to the room of requirement to turn into this. He first cast a bubblehead charm on himself, then urged the giant eagle beneath him toward Fred. It wasn't easy. The bird's flight had gone choppy as the hurricane kicked up more and more junk, and debris slammed through the air. Scott lay on the eagle's back, using charms to block or deflect incoming wreckage, while he coaxed the bird carrying Fred to cooperate. As the 2 eagles crossed paths, Scott fired an Expelliarmus at Fred. Expelliarmus! The red jet hit Fred's hand cleanly. He loosened his grip. Both the long wand and Fred's own wand flew free and arced toward Scott. The hurricane made it impossible for Scott to catch them by hand, but he had another idea. Flock of birds! With a sharp crack from the tip of his wand, 2 black crows materialized and darted forward, snatching the 2 wands in their claws and returning to the eagle behind Scott. The hurricane, deprived of fresh force, began to die down. The debris it had lifted rattled and fell back to the floor. "Are you all right, Fred?" George called. "I'm fine," Fred managed. "Then what on earth were you doing?" Eddie demanded. "I don't know," Fred shouted back. As the rubble settled, the room finally calmed. "Let's go down." Scott ordered the 4 giant eagles to descend slowly to the floor. George leapt from his bird and shoved through the piled junk to haul Fred off. Fred slumped against him, smiling but weak as if he might topple. "Fine?" George scoffed. "You look like a wet noodle." "That blasted wand drained all my energy," Fred said, grimacing. "Otherwise, how could you keep casting such a huge Accio?" George muttered. Scott and Eddie dismounted and walked over. 2 crows carrying wands hovered at Scott's shoulder. "Thanks, Scott," George said to him. "You saved us again. Fred especially, that unlucky sod." "You're welcome," Scott replied. He looked at Fred with some amusement. "This is what happens when you pick things at random, Fred." "Who'd have thought?" Fred blinked. "I suppose I can only blame my luck." Eddie peered at him. "How did it feel, anyway?" "I can't explain," Fred said with a faint smile. "Maybe like Imperio?" Scott took Fred's wand from one of the crow's claws and handed it back, mimicking Ollivander's tone. "Remember, Mr. Weasley, the wand chooses the wizard." "Thanks." Fred took it weakly, then glanced at the other crow holding the long wand. Why didn't that thing make the crow do anything? Crows can't cast spells, Scott said with a small smile. They don't have magical power. What's up with this wand? Eddie leaned closer to inspect it. Is there a curse inside? Fred tried optimism. Maybe it's a high-level prank wand. Eddie stared. George snorted. If that's a prank, it's a bit lethal. We nearly died. All right, Fred admitted. It's an evil, cursed wand. Scott reverted the giant eagles back into desks with his wand and said, Let's get out. I'll take this wand to a professor. They trudged over the debris toward the door. Scott glanced back and stopped short. That troll specimen, he whispered. Its head's gone. The three turned to him. Did my Oxio do that? Fred murmured. I could have blown a troll's head off? He sounded both amazed and a little smug. I'll go take a look, Scott said, pulled a broom from his moleskin pouch and vaulted onto it. A Nimbus 2000? Eddie gasped. You actually have a broom? Scott only smiled. He flew up to the troll specimen. Its head was indeed absent. The neck stump looked old and smooth, not freshly torn. It seemed the head had been removed long before the specimen was assembled and then somehow reattached. Scott dropped low and picked up a rusty short sword from the floor. Hovering at the height of the troll's shoulder, he prodded the neck stump with the blade. The skin gave like a thin film, and a dark hollow yawned inside. A foul miasma, the reek of troll rear, hit him. Reflexively, Scott cast a bubblehead charm and then flicked Lumos so the tip of his wand lit the cavity. The whole troll seemed to be nothing but a shell. Its interior was mostly empty. As Scott watched, a small brass box, tucked inside the chest cavity, glinted in the light from his wand. The others, having struggled through the debris, arrived a moment later. Scott, what did you find? Eddie asked. Scott considered how to remove the box. It was larger than the neck opening, so it couldn't be pulled up through the throat, and the breastbone looked solid. Eddie stepped close, then recoiled. It reeks, he complained. Worse than before. George and Fred stopped and peered up. Scott circled the specimen on his broom, looking for signs it had been forced open and repaired, but there were none. He pointed to the ribs. There's a brass box inside. A box? Eddie and the twins were instantly excited. Get it out! See what's inside! Scott shook his head. It won't be easy, he tried. Defindo. The cutting charm thunked harmlessly against the troll's toughened hide. Reducto. Confringo. The charms made dull drum-like sounds as if hitting a drum. The skin didn't even mark. He tried the spells on the chest, back, and belly. He even attempted to shrink the brass box and used his best transfiguration. Nothing altered. The specimen and its hidden box were unresponsive. Even a specimen beats you, Scott, Fred teased, then winced as he remembered his weakened state. Scott didn't mind. The more impervious it was, the more extraordinary its origin seemed. He thought of the crumple-horned snorkack horn Luna had given him last Christmas, but he dismissed the idea. He hadn't tested it, and an explosion either might be too weak or else destroy the box entirely. The twins and Eddie tried, no luck. Scott finally said, there are really only two likely options. 1. Go to the headmaster's office and borrow Gryffindor's sword from Dumbledore. 2. Learn Snape's signature hex, Sectum Sempra. George groaned. Neither is ideal. I'd rather pester Dumbledore for the sword than learn Severus's dark tricks. No, Fred said suddenly. There's another way. All three looked at him. Fred turned toward the crow that held the long wand. You still want to use that thing? Eddie begged. No, this wand makes whoever holds it act without thinking. We might get hurt, George agreed. Besides, last time it just made you use Accio. No, that's not right, Fred said. It was my choice to do Accio, Thwile. The wand just drained my energy to boost it. Eddie frowned. Why would you want to boost Accio at all? Fred shrugged. It sounded like fun. I thought about it, and then, well, it made me do it. Scott was about to say he'd go see Dumbledore immediately when Fred suddenly lunged and snatched the long wand from the crow's talons. Fred, George snapped. Scott pointed his wand. Defindo. A red glow struck the troll's chest. Crack. Lines spidered across the specimen. At the same moment, Fred collapsed, utterly spent. George grabbed him. Fred's face was pale. The long wand clattered from his fingers. I told you I'd be fine, he whispered, a tired, triumphant smile on his lips. I don't have much stamina left, but I can feel it. It won't kill me. With that, he rested his head on George's shoulder and fell into a heavy sleep. Eddie stared, half amused, half exasperated. Scott had the same thought. Was that really necessary? He had intended to take the wand straight to a professor or to borrow Gryffindor's sword. Still, the specimen was continuing to split. "Look," George said. "It's coming out." Scott wheeled his broom back, landed, and threw up a protego. A wall of shimmering magic shielded them as the troll's outer shell disintegrated. The hide broke apart and fell away in chunks. The specimen collapsed in a dusty heap, but the barrier kept the four of them clean. When the dust settled, Scott set his broom aside and pried the brass box free with a dagger. "Finally," Eddie breathed, waving a hand in front of his nose. "Open it." Scott crouched and examined the box up close. It looked old, exquisitely engraved, and seam-free, more like a perfect cube than a box. He tapped and scratched at it with the dagger and couldn't find anywhere to begin. The object felt hollow. "It's empty inside," he said, perplexed. They all peered at it. "What's going on?" Eddie asked. Scott shook his head. "We'll put it away for now." He rinsed the smelly box under a water charm, dried it, and slid it into his mokeskin pouch. The crow had already reclaimed the long wand and hovered beside him. George levitated Fred, and they made their way out of the room of requirement. From the 8th floor down to the hospital wing, the floating, snoring Fred attracted attention. Madame Pomfrey was not pleased. "It's you lot again," she snapped at George. "What have you been up to? Another fight?" They looked more rumpled than hurt. "No fighting, Madame Pomfrey," George said quickly. "Fred's not injured. He's just exhausted." Madame Pomfrey glared. "Exhausted from overuse of magic, I expect." She hustled them out of the hospital after she had Fred on a bed. "And don't traipse into the wards unless you absolutely must." Scott's stomach grumbled. They'd missed dinner in the room of requirement. The three of them had no objections to rushing to the kitchens. The house elves greeted them with breathless enthusiasm and sent up a nourishing meal to Fred in the hospital wing, so they didn't worry about him. Eddie looked at the crow carrying the long wand and asked Scott, "Are you going to Dumbledore later?" Scott nodded. "Dumbledore or Professor Flitwick?" "Then go to Flitwick," Eddie said. George agreed immediately. Scott smiled. Flitwick was kinder and less imposing than Dumbledore, easier to approach. In Hogwarts, everyone respected Dumbledore, but when it came to pleasant, practical help, Flitwick was the one you asked. 357, 337. A piece of history, ceiling. After dinner, Scott and the others went back up to the 8th floor and knocked on Professor Flitwick's office door. "Come in," came Flitwick's voice. Scott pushed the door open and led the three others inside. "Good evening, Professor Flitwick," they said in unison. Flitwick, bent over his desk with a quill in hand, looked up, surprised to see them. He recovered quickly. "Ahem, do you need something?" Fred made himself at home the moment he entered, glancing around the office. He pointed at the crow perched behind Scott and called out, "Professor, we found a wand that can control people, like the Imperious Curse." "Imperio?" Flitwick's quill skittered across the parchment. Fred and George, working together, began to recount their adventure in the room of requirement. Flitwick stared at the long wand the crow had brought in, frowning in disbelief. "Such a thing exists?" Scott and Eddie both nodded and told what had happened when Fred was controlled by the wand. Eddie's version was, predictably, far more dramatic, and even Fred listened with interest. When they finished, Flitwick's expression grew grave. The crow hopped to the desk, laid the long wand on the table, and flew out through an open window. Flitwick set his quill aside, drew his wand, and murmured a string of incantations. Charms of different colors flew from his wand and struck the strange wand one after another. He watched its reactions intently for a long moment, then straightened. "Preliminary tests show this to be a peculiar alchemical construction," he said. "And yes, its design is certainly for harm." He paused, sighed, and added, "This reminds me of a piece of history." Scott and the others leaned in. "Take out the box you took from the troll specimen," Flitwick told Scott. Scott unfastened a battered lizard skin satchel at his hip, loosened the drawstrings, and poured a small square brass box onto the desk. Flitwick jumped down from his chair and examined the box, tracing the intricate patterns with narrowed eyes. "None of you would recognize this," he murmured. "It's actually a form of writing." "Writing?" Scott peered at the patterns again, realizing they weren't mere decoration, but discrete, non-repeating marks. "Yes," Flitwick smiled. But very few people know it now. Can you read it? Eddie asked. I'm afraid I can't, Flitwick admitted. It's already remarkable I can identify it as writing at all. He laughed lightly and flicked his wand. Let's fetch a few more eyes. Expecto Patronum. A small, silver-white bird of light shot from his wand and flew out of the office. Flitwick looked back at Scott. You've been learning this charm, haven't you, Scott? Scott had. He'd been studying the Patronus charm with Flitwick. Not yet perfectly, Professor, he said. Flitwick had told him the Patronus was one of the most powerful, ancient defensive charms, extremely difficult to cast fully. It could repel Dementors and shield the mind from certain dark arts. Scott had learned the theory and was practicing. He raised his wand. Expecto Patronum. A silver mist puffed from his wand, vapor that didn't quite take animal shape. You've the start of it, Flitwick said encouragingly. Most adult wizards only reach that level. Very few can conjure a complete corporeal Patronus, but I believe you'll succeed. Fred and George whispered to each other, I want to try. What will our Patronuses be? Maybe 2 bludgers, Scott joked. The twins raised their eyebrows, about to reply, when a translucent figure drifted through the doorway and between them. It was Professor Binns, the floating, monotone history of magic professor. Ah, you're here, Binns, Flitwick called. Come and look at this. Binns's gaze fixed on the brass box. He leaned forward and extended a hand, intending to pass his ghostly fingers through the object. His hand did not pass. He seemed to meet solid resistance on the lid. Incredible, Flitwick breathed. There was a knock, and the office door opened as Professor Dumbledore entered, smiling warmly at the students. Good evening. I hear you've had another adventure with some interesting finds. Yes, Professor. We found an evil wand and an unbreakable box. Fred and George crowed. Dumbledore joined Flitwick and Binns at the desk and bent to inspect the items. Do you see anything, Binns? Flitwick asked. Binns, in his usual flat tone, replied, I'm still looking. Why don't you inspect the wand, Albus? You're the most experienced with alchemy here. Dumbledore cheerfully obliged and began to examine the long wand. The 3 professors were absorbed in the 2 objects, leaving Scott and the others awkwardly standing by. Not wanting to interrupt, they grew bored. Fred and George quietly played rock, paper, scissors while Eddie kept score. Scott watched them and nearly laughed aloud. Dumbledore noticed. You may go now, he told them. When we have a conclusion about these items, we'll inform you. Thank you, Professor. The twins burst for the door. Scott and Eddie said their goodbyes and followed. As Scott closed the office door, Eddie was already pulling a small booklet from his pocket. Come on, let's get the orders finished. We mustn't waste time. They hurried down to the 3rd floor, through the secret passage, toward the workshop for the magic crystal player orders. Fred lit the candles, and Eddie asked, Scott, what do you need us to do? Scott set a mirror on the workbench. Eddie had arranged for a Muggle factory to make several boxes of mirrors. They'd arrived in leather cases enchanted with the undetectable extension charm and had been delivered by a flock of owls. Scott picked up a wooden block from a drawer and posed the question he'd been turning over. Can we stamp the runic circuits, like using a seal? There were many mirrors to prepare. He didn't want to handwrite the runes on each one. Good idea, clever Scott, the twins said in unison. We tried that, George added. It always failed. Runic circuits need magical modulation while they're engraved or written, Fred explained. A mere stamp can't do that. You can try, George added, grinning. Scott placed the ebony block on the mirror and produced his wand. With a small, practiced flick, he flattened and stretched the block until it covered the mirror, then set his wand aside and flipped the board over. A raised, precise runic circuit was carved into its face. The twins gaped. Oh, so it can be done? Eddie asked, amused. Why didn't you try that before? Because our transfiguration isn't that good, Fred said. Yours isn't bad, though. Scott took another bottle from the drawer, a mixture of mercury and powdered crystal. He transformed a small wooden piece into a brush, dipped it in the mercury, and carefully coated the raised runes. The twins watched closely. Now comes the tricky part, George warned. You have to activate the runic circuit on the mirror at the exact moment you stamp it. Not too soon, or the runes will activate on the stamp instead, and keep the mercury from running everywhere. Scott steadied the board with one hand. Mercury has a tendency to flow, but the ebony and Scott's magic were compatible. With a focused push of will, he stabilized the coating just enough to prevent it from running. He flipped the board down to cover the mirror, and with his other hand, touched his wand to the board and triggered the runic circuit. Crack, crack, the mirror shattered. Tiny fragments skittered across the workbench. Fred shrugged. "Oh, failed." "Looks like you can't cut corners when writing runic circuits," George said, shrugging in perfect unison with his brother, as if the outcome had been the only possible one. Scott looked at the cracked magic mirror and set down the wooden board he'd been using like a stamp. "I guess I was trying to be too clever," he said with a laugh. "Think about it. How many alchemists down the ages have researched ancient runes? If there were a simple shortcut to replace carving or inscribing them, it wouldn't have taken me to figure it out." Fred and George laughed too. "When we first tried it, we knew the odds were almost zero," Fred said. "But we had to try it ourselves," George added, "just to be sure." Eddie frowned. "If that's true, does that mean every workshop that makes magical items needs wizards to do this? That would be horribly inefficient." Eddie's father, Mr. Carmichael, owned several factories and was always keen on mechanization. He couldn't understand why wizards still relied on handcrafting when Muggle industry had come so far. Scott didn't mind. He shrugged and said calmly, "Think of the wizarding population. Handmade production is plenty to supply the magical market." He had already given up on finding a shortcut. He turned, picked up another mirror, pulled out a quill, and began to write the runes by hand. In truth, the runic combination for the magic crystal player was much simpler than the one he'd tried on the mirror, and it wouldn't take long. Scott just hated repetitive, mechanical work. Since it was unavoidable, he shifted his attitude and treated the exercise as practice. Writing runic circuits helped him master the harmonization of magical power, essential if he wanted his transfiguration idea of 1-second alchemy to become instinctive. "Aren't you going to look for other methods?" Eddie asked, surprised that Scott had given up so readily. "No," Scott replied without stopping. "Even if another method exists, it won't be something you can research quickly." With Scott's current level in ancient runes and alchemy, aside from the little trick he'd just tried, there really wasn't another practical approach. Eddie still couldn't get his head around the cost problem. "This is a nightmare," he muttered. "If we have to handcraft every one, we can't control costs." Fred and George were busy with their own tasks and ignored him. Scott finished activating the runic circuit on the mirror and handed it over. "You're on casing and packing," he told Eddie. "Put the plastic shell on and box them up." "Fine." Eddie took the mirror, found a custom-molded hard plastic case among the boxes in the corner, snapped it around the back and sides, then slid the wrapped mirror into a plain white, hard cardboard box. The plastic cases came in 4 colors, each matching the representative color of the 4 houses, and printed with the house crests, and the outer box was simply white with the product name and Prank Workshop printed on it. They'd had these made through Eddie's family business at a low price. The packaging made the product look more official and, more importantly to Eddie, justified charging more. Scott picked up another mirror and kept writing. "Don't think it's bad to be handmade. You can sell it as luxury. Plenty of Muggle luxury items are handmade." "You're right," Eddie brightened. "My family's jewelry line has a handcrafted range. They cost a lot more." "Rich people have more to spend," Scott said with a smile. "Figure out how to sell to the rich in the wizarding world." Fred and George chuckled. "Go after the pure-blood families," George suggested. "They always spend to keep up appearances." Though Scott wrote quickly, they didn't finish until after 1 in the morning. Once all the players were wrapped, Eddie loaded them into his backpack, charmed with an undetectable extension charm, and the 4 left the workshop to head for the slide near the secret passage. "Quick, check where Filch and his cat are," Scott yawned, handing the Marauder's map to Fred. Fred, also yawning, muttered, "It's so late, Filch should be asleep." "His nasty cat is awake at night," George said. "And don't forget Peeves. If he spots us, he'll make a fuss." "I know." Fred whispered the map's activation charm again. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." He held his lit wand for light and peered. "Filch is in his office. The cat's down in the dungeons. Peeves is near the library. He frowned. Oh, Dumbledore and Professor Binns are still in Flitwick's office. Still researching those two things, Eddie whispered in surprise. Maybe that box was a powerful artifact. Are you saying we shouldn't have handed it in? George asked. We found it at Hogwarts, Fred pointed out. It belongs to the school. Eddie shrugged, a little rueful. I was just thinking about the money. Don't dwell on it, Scott said. He summoned a battered flying broom from beside the slide and swung onto it. The others stared up at him. What? He asked. Scott, Fred said, you always carry a flying broom. And it's a Nimbus 2000, George added with a grin. Scott laughed. I'm used to riding broken brooms. Let's go. He pushed off, and they flew back toward the castle. Scott used his magic sense to guide Eddie safely to the Ravenclaw common room. It was late. Everyone had gone to bed. The common room was dark and empty. Eddie, complaining of hunger, lit the fire, took a tin kettle from the table, and set about boiling milk. He sat by the hearth, warming his hands, and asked, Don't you feel like too much has happened lately? Scott, on the sofa, raised an eyebrow. Like what? Everything, Eddie said quietly. We all say we'll do things in the future, but we know the wizarding world is getting unstable, right? Scott nodded. They'd all seen the surreptitiously recorded footage from Little Hangleton and understood how serious things could be. The wizarding world looked calm on the surface, but beneath, currents were shifting. With Eddie's ear for gossip, it was natural he felt anxious. Don't worry, Scott said. Whatever's happening outside, Hogwarts is safe. Eddie pouted. If it keeps getting worse, after we graduate, we might have to hide in the Muggle world. Scott's voice was flat. There's no point worrying about it now. Right, Eddie watched the flames. We're just students. There's only so much we can do. A small gurgle warned them the milk was at boiling. Eddie grabbed 2 cups, cleaned them with a charm, poured, and took a sip. I'd still like to know what happened to those people who were arrested the other day. There's no way to put a panoramic telescope in the ministry, is there? Scott smiled faintly and took a sip. Maybe your guess about the box is right, but Dumbledore said he'd tell us the results. I don't think he'll break his word. Eddie sighed. I just hope nothing big happens that affects the whole British wizarding world. If things spill into the Muggle world, we might even have to emigrate to stay safe. He glanced up at Scott. You sent your parents abroad because you were worried, didn't you? No choice. Scott set down his cup. There are a lot of people who dislike me, even hate me. They might try to retaliate. The next day, Scott was listless from staying up late. Professor Flitwick, too, seemed low on energy and charms. He tried to teach as usual, but wasn't his bubbling self. Scott spent the lesson, half expecting the professor to slump over a stack of books and fall asleep. When class ended, Flitwick hurried off, and Scott missed his chance to ask about the overnight research that Dumbledore and Binns had been part of. Eddie, by contrast, had a busy morning selling the finished Magic Crystal players and collecting payment. As expected, the player and the Ravenclaw promotional video, Overcoming Wisdom, were a hit around Hogwarts. The players Scott and his friends sold could only play that one audio-visual file, and since the promo video was looped in the Great Hall all day Sunday, Ravenclaw students were striding about full of swagger. Scott, already a known Ravenclaw, drew attention again as the creator of both the video and the player. At lunch, Milton told him, Professor Trelawney mentioned you in divination this morning. Oh? Scott felt an odd prickling. What did she say? Milton laughed. She said that although you're gifted, because you don't take her class, you'll never reach your full potential. Scott let out a relieved breath. Good. I don't want her predicting terrible things about me. Roger, at his elbow, looked surprised, as if discovering a new continent. You're scared of Trelawney? Most of the time, her predictions are nonsense, Scott said aloud, but privately he thought of the original work he'd read in a previous life. Trelawney had a reputation for awful accuracy. Casually spoken words of hers often seemed to come true. Sometimes it was like a curse. That afternoon, after lessons, Scott made his way toward the edge of the Forbidden Forest and found himself in the castle's back garden. There, of all people, was Professor Trelawney, hair in disarray, thick glasses gleaming, scent of stale wine about her. She looked as if she'd wandered out of her classroom in a trance. Good afternoon, Professor Trelawney. Scott said politely, though he'd hoped to avoid her. Good afternoon, Scott Trollope, my poor child. Trelawney's eyes widened behind her lenses. The inner eye tells me I must leave the North Tower today, she intoned dramatically. But to meet you here, oh, my poor child. She reached out as if to pat his shoulder, pitying, maternal. At the last moment, she flinched as if shocked by something unseen, withdrew her hand and took a quick step back. I'm so sorry. Child, I'm so sorry. Her face fell into a look of grief. I have only just discovered. She broke off with an embarrassed burp, and her features shifted in an instant. Scott felt a chill run through him. Something in the air had moved. His own face went pale. The breeze off the forest seemed to still as if listening. The moment stretched, heavy with an unnamed threat, and Scott knew, without knowing how, that whatever Trelawney had seen or felt, it was bad. 359. Terrible prophecy. Chaotic situation. Hoo. Trelawney made a series of strangled noises, her whole body beginning to twitch. Her eyes behind their spectacles were unnaturally wide, as if they might pop out. Her hands, knuckles thin as twigs, scratched at her tangled hair until it looked like a bird's nest. The dozen or so odd necklaces at her throat clinked together with a dry, metallic sound. Holy crap! The exclamation slipped out of Scott before he could stop it. It felt like the only adequate response. Still keeping his composure, he fished his panoramic telescope from the deformed lizard skin bag at his waist and, almost automatically, activated the eagle-shaped brooch pinned to his chest. For reasons he couldn't explain, it felt as though something unseen was tugging both him and Trelawney toward the same moment. Trelawney shuddered, and the twitching subsided. Her round eyes rolled upward until there was almost nothing but white. Her expression went blank, and her hands folded against her chest, trembling. Her voice came out simultaneously like a roar and a wail, an ugly, grating sound that made Scott wince. It was like a chorus of 100 women shrieking in his ears. The scroll of history opens. The revived witch stirs up a storm, distorting the vision of the 1,000-mile eyes, she intoned. The slumbering Great One shall awaken, seizing the eternal king's legacy. He desires to devour the non-existent, thereby escaping the shackles of fate. He will ultimately fail, defeated by the hand of the non-existent. Scott felt the hairs on his arms rise as the sentences fell over him. Just when he thought he couldn't take any more, Trelawney fell silent. Another series of odd noises rattled out of her throat. She twitched again, and finally her head drooped as if drained of strength. Soon she stood utterly still and then, after a moment, began to snore softly, apparently asleep on her feet. Scott kept recording with the panoramic telescope. After a few more seconds, he cleared his throat and spoke gently. Professor Trelawney? The snoring continued. He sighed and raised his voice. Professor Trelawney! She startled awake, stumbling a couple of steps, nearly falling until she steadied herself. For a long moment, she looked like someone waking from a deep, disorienting dream. Her unfocused eyes slowly cleared, and she slipped back into her theatrical mystic pose, pitying him with watery solemnity. Oh, my poor child, she said then abruptly. Burp. The burp ruined the effect. She straightened and tried to continue as if nothing had happened. Scott closed the telescope and, keeping a calm tone, said, You've had a bit too much to drink, Professor. No, she protested airily. I only use a little alcohol to steady myself. She spoke more smoothly as she went on. You wouldn't understand. My inner eye sees too much. Sometimes I must dull it to get by. Scott's smile felt brittle. The words she had just spoken in that trance played over and over in his head, and his mind refused to let it go. Trelawney, seeing his expression, forced an air of regal divination. It was possible she didn't even realize she had genuinely prophesied. She probably thought she'd simply embarrassed herself while tipsy, but she kept up the act. What can I say? She murmured theatrically. It's a pity, child. A pity your inner eye is closed. You didn't choose my class. She walked toward him, then stopped at his side, turning to regard him from the corner of her eye. If you wish to break through the fog and learn truths of fate, come find me in the divination classroom in the North Tower. With a sudden, ostentatious sob, an affectation as much as anything, she hurried away, her messy footsteps betraying the act. Scott watched her until she was out of sight, then let the torrent of thoughts he had been bottling burst forth. He shook his head and replayed the prophecy aloud in his mind. The scroll of history opens. The revived witch stirs up a storm, distorting the vision of the 1,000-mile eyes. The slumbering Great One shall awaken, seizing the eternal king's legacy. He desires to devour the non-existent, thereby escaping the shackles of fate. He will ultimately fail, defeated by the hand of the non-existent. What did it mean? Scott turned each phrase over and over. His first thoughts, the revived witch had to be Medea. The eternal king sounded like Arthur. The non-existent, he felt sick as he considered it, was very likely himself. But the rest was a fog of metaphors and names. What was the scroll of history? Was it literally a scroll or a metaphor for history itself? Who or what were the 1,000-mile eyes? People, a magical artifact, a spell. The Great One, Merlin, one of Hogwarts' founders? Legacy, devour, shackles of fate. He kept grasping at meanings and finding nothing concrete. He'd thought about it so long his head throbbed. For a moment, he even wished he could obliviate himself, to forget the whole thing. From logic and his world knowledge came the lesson of prophecies. Trying to chase a prophecy can be the very thing that drags you into it. Lord Voldemort's fate was an example of that. His obsession brought it to pass. Scott hesitated. Should he discard these clues as dangerous, or was it precisely because he had heard a true prophecy that he had to pay attention? The more he worried, the harder it was to think clearly. "Scott! Scott! Scott!" The familiar call snapped him back. He looked up at the raven perched on the kapok tree in the garden. Lambo cocked his head, fluffed his feathers, and fixed his round black eyes on Scott. "What's wrong?" the bird asked in a low, oddly worried voice. "I've never seen you like this." "I'm fine," Scott said, and pinched the bridge of his nose, forcing himself to calm down. Lambo tilted his head. "I waited for you in the Forbidden Forest a long time." Scott forced a smile. "Sorry, I ran into Professor Trelawney and talked with her for a while." "You know her?" Lambo asked. "Do you?" Scott was surprised. Lambo shook his head. "Not really, but I saw a mad witch in the Forbidden Forest. She snuck a whole box of empty wine bottles into the lake." Scott had to laugh despite himself. So Trelawney hadn't appeared by some mystical calling after all. She was simply getting rid of empties. That made the encounter more, not less, baffling. After all, they'd never had any dealings. He'd only ever seen her from afar at feasts, when she bothered to attend. And now she'd supposedly come up to him to deliver a prophecy? Coincidence felt too small a word. "Are you sure you're okay?" Lambo asked again, earnest. Scott nearly lied and said he was fine, but he was in front of Lambo, his artificial companion, and there was no need to pretend. "I don't know," he admitted. Lambo, clever and increasingly human in his ways, still struggled with subtlety. His concern tended to be literal and direct. He flew up to scan the garden to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then settled back on the kapok tree and spoke in a level, relieved tone. "You look like you're in a bad mood. Let me tell you some good news." Scott had just cast a quick silencing charm as a precaution and then breathed a little easier. "All right, what is it?" "Some of the people you hate have been locked up in Azkaban," Lambo said, flapping his wings as if expecting a reward. Scott raised an eyebrow. "Who? Death Eaters? Green robes? Who was captured?" Lambo rattled off what he'd seen and learned. "Many I can't even name, and many have used connections to get off, but 2 members of the Yaxley family have gone in." Scott's interest sharpened. "What happened?" "You wouldn't believe it," Lambo said, clearly enjoying the drama. "The patriarch of the Yaxleys is a green robe supporter, but his son is a Death Eater. Father and son, both caught that night." "They were hedging their bets," Scott said in disbelief. "They actually tried to play both sides?" Lambo nodded. He had been paying attention, learning the messy politics. "Yes, the green robes had Medea's allies in the ministry helping them, and the Death Eaters are backed by powerful pureblood families. But when the heat came, both sides abandoned that father and son." Scott felt a flicker of satisfaction. He had wasted effort dealing with the Yaxleys in the past, only to have them implode on their own. But another concern surfaced. Is the ministry really this unstable? People attacked Aurors and walk free? Lambo's tone darkened. "The ministry is in chaos. Minister Fudge has joined the Green Robes, and he's close to Mr. Greaves, Milton's father." Scott's 2-week absence from the Court of School Affairs suddenly felt like skipping several key episodes of a serial. Things were moving too fast. If you can't beat them, join them, huh? Lambo laid out the factions plainly. There are 3 groups. First, Medea's Green Robes faction. It's broad, with some pure-blood families aligning with her. With Fudge on their side, they're the most powerful in the ministry right now. Second, a coalition of other pure-blood families. They're staunch pure-blood supremacists and oppose Medea's more egalitarian ideas. They're strong but divided. Internal rivalries weaken them. Third, officials from the Legal Enforcement Squad and a number of Aurors, plus wizards who look to Dumbledore. They're mostly low-ranking, with little influence, holding together on Dumbledore's reputation. Essentially, they're being squeezed out. Scott listened, genuinely impressed. Lambo's recap had been clear and detailed, more than he'd expected from a Raven construct. "You've learned a lot in 2 weeks," he said. Lambo puffed up, proud. "I find humans fascinating. Watching them fight and scheme every day has taught me plenty." Scott almost said, "Holy crap," again. It seemed the bird had evolved faster than expected, absorbing social nuance like a sponge. He said goodbye to Lambo and started toward the castle, his head heavy with the prophecy and the news from the ministry. So much information in so short a time made his thoughts seize and jostle against one another. He had a prophecy full of ominous metaphors and a ministry unraveling into factions. Neither promised anything simple. He drew a long breath and walked on, trying to steady himself for whatever came next. 360. Prophecy and 3 professors. Scott's mind was still racing as he reached the entrance to the Great Hall and remembered, with a jolt, that he had to attend the Transfiguration Club that evening. He checked his pocket watch and realized he was already too late for dinner, so he turned around and went straight to the classroom on the 2nd floor of the castle. He sat through the hour of the club meeting in a fog. Professor McGonagall called him over after the session ended. "Mr. Trollope," she said, her voice a little stern, "I noticed your attention was very unfocused today." "Sorry, Professor McGonagall," Scott replied on reflex. "I don't want to hear apologies, Mr. Trollope," she snapped, then her tone softened. "I know you well enough to know you're not a lazy student. If something is affecting your work, come and speak to your professor about it. Don't let it fester." Scott met her concerned gaze. After a moment, he decided to trust her. The prophecy he'd overheard was complicated, the forces involved beyond anything he could handle alone. He took a breath and began. Something happened. After afternoon class, I met Professor Trelawney in the castle's back garden. At the mention of Trelawney, McGonagall's expression shifted subtly. Her eyebrows lifted, a crease formed between them, and the corners of her tightly pressed lips tightened. She interrupted him, a little impatiently. "Did she tell you something frightening, like a prophecy about you, or someone else, dying on a specific day?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm, and her eyes held an inscrutable meaning. Everyone knows Professor Trelawney forecasts student deaths every year, yet her prophecies never come true. Scott smiled, despite the tight knot in his chest. "I know, Professor. I know Professor Trelawney's pronouncements are usually a kind of performance." He lowered his voice. "But I also know she once gave a true prophecy, the one about Harry and you-know-who." The change on McGonagall's face was immediate. She reached to push her square glasses up her nose. Her lips trembled, and the lines at the corners of her mouth became hard. "I don't know where you heard that," she said, voice faltering. "But I can tell you, she has never produced work at the level a divination professor should since then. I only know Dumbledore offered her the post because of that one prophecy." Scott could see McGonagall's disdain for Trelawney and for divination itself. If he wanted her to take this seriously, he'd have to let her see what he'd seen. He took the panoramic telescope from his chameleon skin pouch and then pulled out his magic mirror. McGonagall was about to protest, but changed her tone when she recognized the devices. "Is that the device you invented that can store images and sound?" Scott nodded, drew his wand, and expertly extracted the image and audio from the telescope and from the eagle-shaped brooch he'd used as a recorder. He imported them into the magic mirror, and after a quick swipe across its surface to combine the video and audio, placed it on the podium. He tapped the mirror, and the still image began to move. Clear sound followed. "Hoo, hoo, hoo." Professor Trelawney's voice poured from the mirror, a haunted, keening wail. McGonagall's frown deepened. her face going suddenly solemn as the voice intoned, "The scroll of history opens, the resurrected witch, the great one who sleeps, he desires to devour, and falls at the hands of the non-existent one." The recording captured Trelawney at her most convulsive and eerie, the sound like hundreds of spectral women wailing. Scott rubbed his aching ears as the recording returned to Trelawney's usual exaggerated performance and froze. McGonagall looked up at him. "Mr. Trollope, this might be a genuine prophecy," she said slowly, "but it doesn't seem to have anything to do with you." "I think I am the non-existent one she spoke of," Scott said quietly. "My intuition tells me that." His explanation sounded clumsy even to his own ears, but he had no better way to put it. Telling them he'd transmigrated from another world, or that this world had been a novel in his previous life, would have sounded even stranger. In the wizarding world, though, intuition and premonition weren't immediately dismissed. A wizard trusting his intuition was plausible enough. McGonagall's face revealed genuine concern. "We must inform Professor Dumbledore," she said apologetically. "I'm sorry, I've no experience with prophecies of this sort." She tried to regain her composure, and after a steadying breath, tapped her wand into motion. Expecto Patronum. Silver mist spurted from her wand and formed a silvery tabby cat that moved between substance and spirit. The cat leapt off and bounded out through the door to seek Dumbledore. While they waited, McGonagall replayed the fragments, attempting to interpret them. Her efforts were no more conclusive than Scott's. She suggested the resurrected witch might be Medea Slytherin, though she couldn't be certain, especially not having heard Trelawney's earlier prophecy about Thestrals with Luna. Footsteps hurried in, and Dumbledore pushed open the classroom door, Professor Flitwick close behind him. "Oh, Scott," Flitwick panted, breathless. "I heard." "Filius, Albus, look at this first," McGonagall said, handing the mirror to Flitwick. He tapped it open like someone who'd played with the device before. Dumbledore leaned in to watch. "Who? History. Witch. Sleeps. Devour. Fail." Trelawney's voice echoed from the mirror. Flitwick almost dropped it at the sound, his pointed ears flattening. Scott, too, felt his ears sting. Flitwick covered his own, enduring the rest of the recording. When it finished, McGonagall summarized Scott's intuition without waiting for him to speak. Dumbledore only glanced at Scott as she finished. Scott understood the headmaster. He wouldn't press for an impossible explanation, but he was tolerant and willing to accept Scott's identification of himself with the non-existent one. Flitwick's worried look was unmistakable. He stared at Scott as if hoping for reassurance, then looked back to Dumbledore. "Albus, how should we interpret this?" he asked. Dumbledore's expression grew serious. "I'm sorry, Filius. I cannot fully interpret it either." Flitwick fretted aloud. "Then what should we do? Start with the Miss Slytherin mentioned in the prophecy. If the resurrected witch is causing the storm, and if we can restrain her and make the storm disappear, then perhaps the prophecy could be averted," McGonagall said, recalling a line from the prophecy. Flitwick's eyes brightened. "That sounds like a plan, Minerva," Dumbledore sighed. "No, the storm has already been stirred and cannot be easily stilled. Albus?" Both McGonagall and Flitwick looked to him. Dumbledore briefly described the chaotic, turbulent state the magical world was currently facing. The two teachers, both dedicated to instruction, looked stunned, like students who had suddenly realized they'd missed an entire season of events. Flitwick's distress was audible. Dumbledore, however, seemed more measured. He turned his gaze to Scott. "Scott," he asked kindly, "do you have any thoughts about the prophecy yourself?" Scott had been about to reassure Flitwick that he was fine, but Dumbledore's question made him speak the first idea that came to mind. "I do have one thought, Professor Dumbledore," he said. He met the three professors' eyes and continued softly. "If I were to completely forget the content of this prophecy, would that prevent me from choosing the path it reveals? If I never know it, could I avoid pursuing that fate?" McGonagall and Flitwick fell silent, thinking it over. Dumbledore offered a single, unsettling reply. "And how do you know that choosing to forget the prophecy now won't itself be the choice that leads you to fulfill it?" Scott opened his mouth and felt like he might cry without tears. "So if a prophecy exists, does that mean someone is chosen by fate and cannot change it?" Dumbledore shook his head. "I'm sorry, my boy. I don't have the right answer for that. I've lived for more than 100 years, but I've never seen fate clearly enough to give you a rule." Silence settled over the classroom. No one offered false comforts. No one insisted that because the prophecy claimed the Great One would fall to the non-existent one, that meant the non-existent one would be safe or happy. A victory could be hollow, costly, or short-lived. No one knew how it might end. After a while, Dumbledore spoke again and smiled gently. The smile was kind and full of tolerance, and it carried a steadiness that felt like a kind of power. "Well then," he said to Scott, "would you like to hear an old man's advice?" Scott felt a little of the warmth of that smile. He nodded. "Of course, Professor."